Hey there, story lovers. This is Bald Vold Amorti, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. What if Harry was betrayed by Dumbledore and reincarnated as the son of Superman with his magic intact? Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1. The space between deaths, the curse hit him in the back. That was the part Harry couldn't stop thinking about, in the half-second between the green flash and the nothing. Not the pain, there wasn't any, which was almost worse, but the direction of it. The back. He'd been walking away from his enemies when he died. He'd been walking toward Dumbledore. The old man's expression, in that final fraction of a moment, wasn't grief. It wasn't horror. It was something carefully arranged to look like both, and Harry had spent enough years reading Dumbledore's face to know the difference between a feeling and a performance. The blue eyes hadn't widened. The hands hadn't moved to stop it. The great Albus Dumbledore, who could have shielded Harry from a dozen killing curses before breakfast, had simply stood there with his silver beard and his half-moon glasses and his expression of terrible, practiced sorrow, and let the curse land. The last thing Harry Potter heard before the world ended was Dumbledore saying, quietly, to someone behind him, "It is done." Not, "He's dead." Not "It is done." Like ticking an item off a list. Then the green light swallowed everything, and Harry fell. The void between lives was not what he'd expected. He'd visited death before, that strange white train station inside his own head, the benches and the high vaulted ceiling and the small broken thing writhing under the seat that had been Voldemort's soul. He'd expected something like that again. Familiar architecture for an unfamiliar journey. Instead, there was just moving. Direction without space. Velocity, without a body to feel it. He was a point of light being threaded through something enormous, and the something enormous didn't care about him in the way weather doesn't care about the person caught in it. Not cruelly, not kindly, just not at all. His magic went with him. He noticed that specifically. In the half-aware dream state of the transition, he could feel his core the way you feel your heartbeat when you press a finger to your wrist, steady, warm, real. It hadn't scattered when he died. Hadn't frayed. Whatever he was in the stripped-down essential sense, the part that had survived Voldemort's first curse at 15 months old, the part that had grown up in a cupboard and still managed to catch a remembrall before it hit the floor, that part was intact, and it was taking his magic with it the way a man going into the water keeps hold of the thing most worth saving. Good, some distant part of him thought. And then everything went quiet. The first thing Harrison James Kent ever did was cry. This struck everyone as completely normal. He was, after all, a newborn, red-faced and furious about it, announcing his arrival to the delivery room of Metropolis General Hospital with the kind of outrage that suggested he had serious objections to the entire process. The nurses said he had his mother's lungs. Clark stood at the edge of the room looking like a man who'd stopped a bullet train with his chest the week before, and was somehow more terrified now, gripping Lois's hand hard enough that she told him, through clenched teeth and rather colorful language, to dial it back, Smallville, I need circulation in those fingers. The boy had black hair, enormous green eyes, a nose that would grow up to be exactly Lois's nose, but didn't know it yet. Lois pressed him against her chest and said, "Hi, you," very quietly, and Clark sat on the edge of the bed and put one careful hand against his son's back. And that was how the House of L came to have 3 members in the year the rest of the world was arguing about something else entirely. They named him Harrison. Clark's mother had known a Harrison, some childhood friend she'd spoken of warmly, and Lois liked that it wasn't a superhero name, wasn't a symbol, was just a name. Something that belonged to the person and not the mythology. His middle name was James, after Lois's father. His last name was Kent, because Clark was Clark Kent in the way that mattered most, even when he was something else. Harrison James Kent. Harry, before he remembered who he used to be. Smallville in summer smelled like cut grass and warm dirt and something just past the edges of town that wasn't quite anything you could name but felt like space, like the reminder that the world was big and the horizon was honest about it. Clark had grown up here. He'd learned to fly in fields like these, learned to hold back in classrooms like the old red brick one Harry attended, learned the specific discipline of being more than human in a world that hadn't asked for it. Harry, at 5, didn't have the holding back problem yet. At 5, he was just a boy who ran faster than the other children on the playground without quite understanding why, who could hear Mrs. Ellison's lesson from across the building when he got bored and started listening elsewhere, who pressed his small palms flat against the grass sometimes and felt something move through his fingers that he didn't have a word for. Not electricity. Warmer than that. Like the grass was saying hello. Martha Kent, Gran, as Harry called her, noticed the grass. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. She'd spent enough years watching Clark to know what different looked like when it was being careful, even when it didn't know it was being careful yet. She made him cookies and asked him about school and taught him chess, and said nothing about the way small flowers sometimes bloomed out of season near where he sat in the garden. Clark noticed too, eventually. He crouched next to Harry in the backyard one afternoon when the boy was 6, watching a single dandelion that had just spontaneously pushed through the dry August ground beside Harry's knee, petals open and yellow and completely at odds with the dead surrounding it. "Did you do that?" Clark asked. Harry considered the dandelion very seriously. "I think so," he said. "It felt lonely." Clark looked at the dandelion. He looked at his son. He made a choice that his own father had made for him once, a long time ago, the choice to not make it strange yet, to not make it a thing, to let the kid breathe before the complications arrived. "Huh," Clark said. "Good." Harry grinned like he'd been expecting an argument and was delighted not to have one. The memories came back when Harry was 7. Not all at once. Not like a flood. More like the way bruises rise, you don't see the injury happening, but hours later the evidence is all over your skin. He'd wake up knowing things he hadn't known the night before. The name of a spell he'd never heard in this life. The exact weight of a wand in a hand he no longer had. The smell of the Hogwarts Great Hall at breakfast, pumpkin juice and candle smoke and old stone. He'd sit up in bed in his room in the farmhouse in Smallville, Ohio, in the body of a 7-year-old who could probably bench press the farmhouse, and he'd hold these fragments and turn them over like coins found in the garden. Old. Real. His. He remembered his name, his other name. He remembered Privet Drive and the cupboard under the stairs, and he remembered a large old man with a long white beard and half-moon glasses who had shaped the whole course of a life, shaped it deliberately, carefully, with the precision of a craftsman and the ethics of one who had decided that other people's lives were raw material. He remembered the curse hitting him in the back. He remembered it is done. Harry lay in the dark of the Kent farmhouse on a Tuesday night in October, and was, for a long time, very quiet. Outside his window he could hear the Kansas wind moving through the fields. Downstairs his father was watching the late news with the volume low, and his mother was laughing at something on her phone, and the sound of both of them was as ordinary and warm as anything he'd ever known. He thought about Dumbledore, not with the white-hot fury he might have expected, that would come later in pieces when specific memories arrived at specific moments and caught him off guard. Right now he just thought. He planned it from the beginning, shaped a boy for sacrifice. Made sure the weapon never suspected what it was, and at the end, when the weapon had served its purpose, it is done. Harry turned onto his side and looked at the wall. He was 7 years old. He had green eyes and black hair and his mother's nose and his father's jaw. He could hear his family breathing 2 floors away. He had memories of a life cut short by a man who decided the math of it was acceptable. He decided, in the calm and practical way that had always been his best quality, and that people consistently mistook for either coldness or naivety, that he was not going to let that be the defining thing. He was going to let it be a fact, the way a scar is a fact, the way gravity is a fact, and he was going to build around it. Then he went asleep, and in the morning he ate Gran's pancakes and raced Clark across 3 fields before school and lost by half a second, because he was laughing too hard to maintain top speed, and his mother took a photo of both of them windblown and red-cheeked at the finish line that would end up framed in the kitchen, and the day was good. By 10, he'd recovered most of it. Not the trauma, that was a different thing, a slower thing. And he was 10 years old in a body that was 10 years old no matter what the soul inside it remembered. And 10-year-olds are not equipped for the full weight of retrospective grief. But the knowledge, the spells, the understanding of what magic was and how it worked and what he could do with it. He told Clark when he was 10. He'd been working up to it for a while, not because he was afraid. Harry wasn't afraid of his father, not even slightly, and wouldn't have been afraid even if Clark hadn't been Superman, but because it was a complicated story and he wanted to tell it well. He caught his father in the barn on a Saturday, working on something mechanical that needed more focus than it was getting, and he sat on a hay bale and said, "Dad, I have to tell you something." Clark looked up immediately. Something in his son's voice, the tone was too old for the face wearing it. It always had been, made him set down his tools. "Okay," Clark said. Harry told him, all of it. The other life, Hogwarts, Voldemort, Dumbledore. He kept his voice even and matter-of-fact the way you get through hard things, not because the hard parts weren't hard, but because if you stop moving, the weight of them will bury you. He watched his father's face move through a series of things, disbelief, then careful consideration, then something that looked a lot like grief on behalf of someone else, then fury, which Clark controlled with the practiced discipline of a man who'd learned very young that fury in his body was a different thing than fury in other bodies. "The curse hit you in the back," Clark said, very quiet. "Yeah." And Dumbledore stood there. Clark's jaw set in a way Harry recognized from news footage of Superman facing down things that needed facing down. "And the magic. You're saying you still have it." "Yeah." Harry held out his hand, palm up, and a small flame bloomed above it, not fire exactly, more like light that hadn't decided yet, warm and silver-white, turning slowly in the air above his fingers. "It came with me." Clark stared at the light in his son's hand for a long moment. He stood up, crossed the barn, sat down on the hay bale next to Harry, and put an arm around the boy's shoulders. "Okay," he said. "That's it," Harry said. "Okay." "I'm going to have a lot of questions and feelings about this," Clark said. "But they can wait 10 minutes. Right now I'm sitting here." Harry leaned against his father's arm. The flame kept turning in his palm, quiet and patient. Outside, a meadowlark was shouting at something. "I don't want to be defined by it," Harry said. "The old life, I don't want to spend this one angry about what happened in that one." "Good," Clark said. "That's good, Harry." A pause, "but it's also okay to be angry about it. I know. You were a child, he used you. I know. Just because you're choosing not to let it rule you doesn't mean it wasn't, Dad." Harry looked up at him. "I know, I was there." The corner of his mouth twitched. "I've had 3 years to think about it. I'm okay." Clark looked at him for a long moment. Then he pulled him a little closer and said, "You're about the most put-together kid I've ever met, and I find it both impressive and vaguely concerning." Harry laughed, and it was a real laugh, bright and surprised, and the light in his palm flared warm for a moment before settling. Lois took it differently, which is to say she took it with both hands and started asking questions at a pace that suggested she'd been suppressing this instinct for a while. She sat across the kitchen table from her son with a coffee mug and a yellow legal pad and said, "So, magic." "Magic," Harry confirmed. "Real magic, not card tricks." "Definitely not card tricks. And you had a wand before. A holly wand, 11 inches, phoenix feather core." Lois wrote this down. "And now," Harry raised an eyebrow. He held up his hand, fingers loose, and the kitchen tap turned on and off again. "Now I don't need one, I've had a few years to. I think the ability to focus magic through a wand is like training wheels. The magic itself doesn't need the wood. Because of the Kryptonian biology. Partly." He'd thought about this a lot. "I think my last body was just human, fully human." The wand created a pathway because the human nervous system isn't built for raw magic the way mine is now. Now the pathway's built in. Lois wrote faster. Clark, watching from the doorway, mouthed, "She's going to write a book," and Harry mouthed, "I know," back. "The old man," Lois said, not looking up from her pad. "Dumbledore." "Yeah, he's dead, I assume, in that universe." "Yeah, he was old when I was born there." Harry paused. "Old before his time, I think. He'd been making decisions that had to be eating him, even if he'd convinced himself they were righteous." That's more charitable than I'd be. I'm not being charitable, Harry said. I'm being accurate. He was brilliant, and he was terrible, and he probably believed every single thing he did was necessary. That makes him more dangerous than someone who knew they were doing wrong. He looked at his mother steadily. I'm not going to waste energy hating a dead man in another universe, but I'm also not going to pretend what he did was anything other than what it was. Lois looked up from the legal pad. She studied her son's face for a moment, the green eyes that were too steady for 10 years old, the expression that kept doing that thing where it skipped about 15 years ahead of the face wearing it. You know, she said, your father and I used to wonder why you always seemed like you were waiting for something when you were little. Waiting, like you'd seen worse and were just keeping an eye on things. She smiled, and it was a complicated smile, warm and a little sad and fiercely proud all at once. Makes more sense now. Harry looked at his mother, this woman who had walked into war zones with a press badge and a recorder and come back with the story, who had known what Clark was and loved him anyway and never let either of them be less than they were, and felt something that was not grief and not relief, but was close to both of them and sitting right between. I like this life, he said. Just that. Lois's expression did something Harry didn't have a category for. She reached across the table and pressed his hand once, quick, and then she picked up her pen again and said, Okay, so the wand mechanics. You said holly and phoenix feather. Explain why that matters. Harry laughed and explained. At 11, no owl came. He'd wondered about this. The magical world of his current universe, and he'd done careful, quiet research, cross-referencing memories with the Kent Family Library and the Metropolis Public Library's more obscure folklore sections, was real. Different in shape from the British wizarding world he'd known, but real. There were practitioners here, hidden communities, schools that didn't send their letters by owls so much as by more contemporary means. The letter that arrived at Smallville Farm on a Tuesday in September was addressed to H.J. Kent in ordinary printed type on an ordinary envelope, no wax seal, no moving calligraphy. Inside was a single card with 3 lines. We know what you are. We'd like to talk. When you're ready, no rush. At the bottom was a phone number. Harry read the card 3 times. He showed it to Clark, who read it with the expression of a man who was being asked to feel several contradictory things simultaneously. He showed it to Lois, who photographed it immediately and then said, Don't call that number from this house. I'm not calling it yet, Harry said. I'm 11. I've got time. He put the card in the small wooden box under his bed where he kept things that mattered and went back to his homework. He'd call it when he was ready, when he'd grown into himself a little more, when the shape of this life was clearer and he had a better sense of who he was going to be in it before other people started telling him. Until then, there was school, and there were the fields of Smallville, and there were summer evenings where Clark would fly them both up above the cloud cover to watch the sunset from a perspective that most people never got, and Harry would sit cross-legged on the air 300 feet above Kansas, held up entirely by his own power, and practice. He practiced every day. Magic was like a muscle, like any of his abilities were like muscles, and he was under no illusions about the world he was growing into. It was a world with gods in it, aliens, ancient forces, a man made of living lightning, a woman forged from myth, his father, who routinely moved mountains when the situation called for it. Harry had no intention of being the weak link. At 12, he could levitate a car without breaking a sweat. At 12, he could also lift a car without breaking a sweat, being his father's son, but he was interested in the distinction. The magic version was different. It felt different in the hands, had different properties, responded to intent in ways that pure physical force didn't. Where his Kryptonian strength was direct, the magic was responsive. It listened. It negotiated. You couldn't muscle magic the way you could muscle a car. He got very good at using both at once. Clark found him practicing in the barn on a winter afternoon, levitating 3 large hay bales while simultaneously keeping himself aloft with no visible effort, writing in his notebook at the same time, pencil moving in midair while his hands were braced on his knees. Showing off, Clark asked. Multitasking, Harry said, not looking up from the notebook. One of the hay bales rotated slowly. I'm trying to understand the interference patterns. Using both at once creates a kind of harmonic. The magic and the Kryptonian, whatever it is. They're not actually the same thing, but they've been sharing the same nervous system long enough that they've started talking to each other. That sounds either very useful or very dangerous. Probably both. Harry finally looked up. He let the hay bales down gently, one by one, and landed. Dad, when you're fighting someone serious, when it's actually dangerous, do you hold back? Clark looked at him. Honest answer, Harry said. I try not to kill anyone, Clark said. That's the line I hold. But below that, Clark considered this for a moment. No, he said finally. Below that number, if someone is genuinely a threat to lives, I don't know, Harry, I don't hold back. Harry nodded, like he was confirming something he'd already figured out. Good, he said. That's what I thought. Why? Harry looked at the barn door, at the gray Kansas winter beyond it, and there was something in his expression then, something old and certain in the young face, nothing grim or violent, just clear. The expression of someone who has already done their accounting and arrived at a clean number. Because I'm not going to, either, he said. When it matters, I'm not going to be someone who shrinks. Clark looked at his son for a long moment, 12 years old and carrying something ancient in him, green eyes steady and certain. You won't, Clark said quietly. Not a command, just a fact he was recognizing. At 13, something changed in the world. It started small, a seismic event in the Balkans that was too regular in its intervals to be natural. A series of aurora-like events over North American cities that showed up on exactly 0 of the usual meteorological monitors, and 3 separate reports in the Daily Planet International desk. Lois kept an eye on these things, and so, therefore, did Harry, of people in isolated communities describing what they called a sound like everything waking up. Clark was dealing with a situation in Southeast Asia and had been for most of October. Lois was in Washington chasing a story about defense contracts that kept trying to eat itself. Harry was in Smallville with Martha, doing homework and tracking the Aurora reports on his laptop with one tab and the AP wire with another. He was not particularly worried. He was interested. He'd pulled up a map of the reported events, plotted them, and sat looking at the pattern for a long time. The lines weren't random. They had a directionality, a pull, and the pulls seemed to be oriented not toward any geographic location, but toward something more like a frequency, a resonance point that his magic could almost taste at the edges if he let himself be quiet enough to feel it. He felt it clearly for the first time just after midnight on a Thursday in late October. He was at the desk in his room, nearly asleep over a history textbook, when it hit him, not painfully, more like the way music sometimes gets inside your chest before you've consciously heard it. A vibration in the deep part of him that was neither Kryptonian nor English nor Smallville. That was just Harry, just the essential point of light that had come through the void intact and found this body to live in. It was calling, whatever it was. Not to him specifically, he didn't think. More like a bell that he was tuned to happen to hear. He stood up from his desk and went to his window and looked out at the Kansas night, flat and enormous and scattered with October stars. The air outside was cold. His breath didn't fog, Kryptonian metabolisms ran warmer than human ones, but he stood there anyway and let himself feel the thing that was resonating through the dark. Magic, he thought, but not his, not like his. Something older and broader and less focused, wild magic, maybe, the kind that lived in the world itself and not in people, the kind that moved through stone and water and wind and didn't take instructions. He thought about the mystery card under his bed. The 3 lines and the phone number. He thought, soon. He told Martha about the resonance in the morning. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee and her reading glasses, working her way through a book about Kansas history, and she listened to him describe it the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, with the specific quality of attention that made you feel like what you were saying genuinely mattered. It's not threatening, he said. It's more like information. something in the world is changing, or something that was already changing is reaching a tipping point, and the magic part of me is noticing. Do you think it has anything to do with you specifically? Martha asked. No, he said, but I think I'm going to end up involved. He smiled, and it was a somewhat rueful smile, the expression of someone who knows that the universe has a sense of irony. I tend to end up involved in things. Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. She was the only person in his life besides Clark who had known something was different about him from the very beginning, who had watched the flowers grow out of season by his feet and decided to make cookies instead of calling a specialist. She was 80-something years old and had in her time known one impossible person very well, and she'd expanded her definition of what a person could be without abandoning her definition of what a person should be. Your father was like that, she said. When he was your age, things found him. She tilted her head. The difference is he was always surprised. You never seem surprised. Hard to be surprised, Harry said, when you've already died once. Martha laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and said, Fair enough. He stood up from the table and stretched, feeling the hum of the thing in the world that was changing still present at the edges of his perception, patient and enormous. He picked up his bag for school. Gran, he said from the doorway, I love this life. I just want you to know that, in case it gets complicated soon. Martha looked at her grandson in the doorway of the kitchen in the farmhouse where she'd raised one impossible person and was now watching another one walk out into the morning. I know you do, she said. And we love you, Harrison, all of us. That part doesn't get complicated. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something important. Then he went out into the October morning, and the door swung shut behind him, and Martha sat alone in the kitchen for a moment with her coffee and her book, and the warm, domestic, ordinary quiet of the Kent farmhouse. And outside the window, the last flowers of autumn were still blooming 3 weeks past their season in the cold ground, where Harrison had been sitting yesterday afternoon. She put her glasses back on and went back to her reading. Down the drive, Harrison James Kent walked toward the road with his bag on his shoulder and his black hair in the wind and the morning sun on his face. And somewhere very far below the threshold of hearing, the world was making a sound like everything waking up. Chapter 2. The boy who flew the thing about Metropolis was that it never stopped moving. Harry had grown up with the wide, breathing quiet of Smallville, the kind of silence that had texture to it, wind in corn, distant highway, the specific creak of the farmhouse settling at night. Metropolis was the opposite of all that. It was a city that seemed to generate its own weather, its own gravity, pulling everything toward its center and keeping it spinning. 16 million people, and the infrastructure to match, towers of glass and steel throwing the afternoon sun around like a pinball, the LexCorp building cutting the skyline like a raised finger, and underneath all of it, the deep bass hum of a place that never fully slept. Harry loved it immediately. He was 16 when Clark and Lois finally made the full move back from Smallville. Clark's work at the Planet had always been nominally Metropolis-based. But for Harry's childhood, they'd split the difference, city apartment and Kansas farmhouse rotating with the seasons. Now Harry was enrolled at Metropolis High. They had a proper apartment on the 23rd floor of a building in the Sullivan district. And Lois was 3 weeks into an investigation that had her coming home at 10 every night with ink on her fingers, and a look in her eyes that Clark recognized as the hunting expression. Harry sat on the apartment's narrow balcony in the evenings and watched the city and let it teach him its rhythms. He'd called the number from the card 3 years ago. At 13, once the world had finished its resonant shudder and settled into whatever it had become on the other side of the change. The conversation had been short and professional, and had resulted in a series of meetings with a small, quiet organization that called itself the Arcanum, practitioners based in North America, mostly, with connections across both hemispheres, who had been tracking the unusual magical signatures coming from the Kent farmhouse in Smallville since Harry was approximately 6 years old. They were not aggressive about it. They were, if anything, slightly in awe, which Harry found uncomfortable, and he'd told the woman who seemed to lead them, a sharp-faced Jamaican-American woman in her 60s named Delphine Marsh, who reminded him slightly of McGonagall if McGonagall had become a federal judge instead of a professor, that he was happy to exchange knowledge and communication, but wasn't interested in being catalogued. Delphine had smiled like he'd passed a test and said, "Good. We don't need another chosen one. We have enough of those." He went to meetings with the Arcanum once a month. He learned things. He taught things. He maintained his independence absolutely. The Arcanum, for their part, had been honest with him about one thing that mattered. The resonance he'd felt at 13 had been real. Something in the fabric between worlds, between his world, the DC universe as he'd come to mentally label it, and others had been thinning. Not dangerously yet, but the direction of the trend was clear. He filed that away. He paid attention. Metropolis High was fine. That was his honest assessment. Fine. The teachers were mostly good. A few were excellent. The social environment was the specific ecosystem of a large urban school, where everyone had sorted themselves into identities with more seriousness than the identities deserved. Harry moved through it easily because he'd spent a childhood learning to move through environments that didn't fit him, and the trick, he'd long since worked out, was not to try to fit. Just to be present, interested, and honest, and let whatever connections formed naturally form. He had 3 friends by October of his junior year. Tam was the first, Tamara Osai, who sat next to him in AP Physics and had correctly identified his homework methodology as doing about 40% of the work and intuiting the rest within the first 2 weeks, and had told him so directly, which he'd appreciated. She was going to be an astrophysicist or an engineer or possibly both simultaneously, and had a sense of humor so dry it was sometimes mistaken for rudeness by people who weren't paying attention. Marcus was the second, Marcus Bell, who played football with the kind of effortless joy that made it clear he was doing it because he loved it, and not because of what it meant socially, which put him in a minority of roughly 1 on the team. He'd started talking to Harry in the lunch line about the city's architecture and hadn't stopped talking since. He wanted to be an urban planner. Celia was the third, and the most complicated, because Celia Vance had the specific quality of perception that made Harry feel occasionally transparent in ways he found both annoying and interesting. She was the school newspaper editor, daughter of 2 journalists, already publishing in actual city outlets, and she looked at the world with the particular intensity of someone who was determined to understand it before it could surprise her. She'd asked him within 2 weeks of school starting, "You're Clark Kent's kid." "Yeah," Harry said. "The Clark Kent. He'd hate you calling him that. Does he know you're—" She'd paused, choosing words carefully. "Remarkable." Harry had looked at her for a moment, not uncomfortable, just assessing. "He's my dad," he said. "So yes." She'd filed that somewhere, he could tell, and hadn't pushed. He liked that. He was running across the rooftops of the Sullivan district at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday in November when the crisis started. This was a habit, a private one, early enough that the city was only half awake. He moved fast enough that cameras couldn't track him, high enough that sleeping windows didn't catch him, and it was the one time of day where he let himself be both things without the careful calibration that daylight required. He wasn't hiding, exactly. He simply hadn't been publicly anything yet, and he preferred to meet the world on his terms rather than have the world meet him by accident. He heard the first explosion before he felt the pressure wave from it. His hearing sorted it from the background noise of the waking city, somewhere south, near the harbor, the particular frequency of structural failure under sudden impact. Then the second explosion, closer, and then someone screaming, and then a sound like a large building deciding it wasn't a building anymore. He was already moving when he heard the third. The harbor district was 20 blocks south, and he was there in under 4 seconds, dropping out of the sky onto a rooftop overlooking the Metropolis Port Authority terminal. And what he saw below him was organized chaos in the specific pattern of a planned attack rather than an accident. 3 of the large cargo cranes had come down, not collapsed, brought down, the structural cuts visible even from here to someone looking for them. One of them had landed on a transit overpass, and the overpass had sheared, and there were cars in the water, and there were people. Harry was off the roof and moving before the thought fully formed. The water was cold. He didn't feel it. He pulled 3 cars to the surface in the first 90 seconds, 1 man unconscious, a woman with a broken arm, 2 kids in the back seat of a Honda who were unhurt but screaming, which under the circumstances was fine. Screaming meant breathing. He got them to the dock and went back down. There were 2 more vehicles. He brought them up. The cranes were the real problem. The one that had hit the overpass had also clipped one of the port warehouses, and the warehouse wall was failing. Harry could hear it failing. The stress fractures working through the concrete with a sound like slow thunder. And inside the warehouse, the automated offloading system was still running, oblivious, which meant there were very likely dock workers who'd come in early and were now trapped between collapsing wall and moving machinery. He went through the side wall. The dock workers, 4 of them, clustered near the far corner, which had been the sensible move, stared at him with the specific expression of people whose morning had become completely unrecognizable. He didn't stop to explain. He got between them and the machinery, and he put his hand flat against the moving loader arm that was about to do serious damage to the nearest man, and he stopped it, the whole enormous mechanism shuddering against his palm and then being still. The wall was going. He could feel the building trying to come apart above him. He looked at the dock workers. "Doors behind you," he said. 20 seconds. They moved. People in real danger almost always moved when someone said a real thing with real certainty. One of them, an older man, gray-bearded, who'd seen enough in his life to recalibrate faster than most, paused at the door and looked back at Harry. "Son," the man said. "Please keep moving," Harry said and put both hands against the ceiling. The wall came down. The roof followed. Harry stood in the wreckage of the warehouse with several tons of concrete stacked above him and around him like a frozen wave, held by both hands and something deeper than hands, the magic working through his arms and into the structure the way water works into cracks, finding every stress point and filling it, holding the shape of the building around himself like a second skeleton. He stood there for a moment, breathing, not because he needed to, but because it helped him think. Then he pushed, carefully, directionally, moving the debris not upward, up was more falling, but outward, away from the dock workers who'd cleared the area, away from the crowd that was forming on the periphery, into the already cleared blast zone to the east where the cranes had come down. He moved 30 tons of structural failure in under a minute and set it down without raising a dust cloud, and walked out of the empty space where the wall had been into the cold harbor morning. There were cameras. He registered this the same moment the crowd did, the moment where everything went from crisis to something else, everyone's phones out, the news van that had made it there in record time with its camera already rolling, the 2 MCPD officers who'd arrived on scene and were now standing very still looking at him with expressions somewhere between professional composure and complete vertigo. Harry looked at the cameras looking at him. He was 16 years old. Black-haired and green-eyed, and standing in harbor water up to his knees in the clothes he'd been running in, not visibly injured, not visibly winded. He was aware that this was the moment, not the one he'd planned, because he hadn't specifically planned a moment, but the inevitable one, the one that couldn't be taken back once it happened. He thought about his father, who had spent the better part of his life negotiating between the thing he was and the world's need to categorize it. He thought about the old life, the scar and the prophecy and the specific way that Dumbledore had weaponized the expectation of sacrifice. You must not fight this, Harry. You must walk into death willingly, and how that strategy required above all else that the weapon believe itself limited. He had no intention of being limited. He walked out of the water, and he let the cameras watch him. One of the MCPD officers, a woman, dark-haired, with the look of someone who'd been in Metropolis long enough to have seen Superman up close and had recalibrated her definition of normal accordingly, found her voice first. "Sir, were you inside that building?" "I was," Harry said. "Are you injured?" He looked at the wreckage he'd moved. There were 4 dock workers trapped near the East Machinery Bay. They went out the side door about 45 seconds ago. Someone should check them. The officer blinked, reached for her radio, made the call. The news van camera was absolutely recording all of this, and Harry turned and looked at it directly, not with aggression, not with performance, just directly, the way you look at a thing you're acknowledging rather than ignoring. "There were 3 deliberate structural failures," he said, clearly enough that the camera would pick it up. "The crane supports were cut. This wasn't an accident." He looked at the officer. "You'll want to get your people to treat this as a crime scene as well as a rescue site." He took off before the follow-up questions started. Straight up, fast, gone before anyone had the angle to track where he'd gone. Behind him, the news van camera tilted toward the sky and caught 3 seconds of a boy-shaped figure disappearing into the low November clouds, and those 3 seconds would be everywhere by 7 a.m. His father was waiting in the apartment. Clark was in his work clothes, not the suit, the Clark Kent clothes, which meant he'd come home from wherever he'd been and gotten here fast and opted for Dad over Superman, which Harry noted and appreciated. He was standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee he wasn't drinking, and when Harry came through the balcony door, he turned and looked at his son for a long moment. "I heard the first explosion," Clark said. "I was already closer," Harry said. "I know, I got there about 2 minutes after you left. I saw the debris field." A pause. "I saw the camera footage on my phone in the air over New Jersey." Harry set his wet shoes by the balcony door. "People were in the water, Dad." "I know that. And the dock workers, Harry." Clark's voice wasn't raised. It was the quieter version of serious, which was actually more serious. "I'm not saying you shouldn't have helped. I know you couldn't not help. That's not what I'm." He stopped. Ran a hand through his hair in the gesture Harry had long since catalogued as Clark Kent dealing with something he'd been afraid of and is now trying to be rational about. "The cameras." Harry leaned against the wall. He met his father's eyes. "Yeah," he said. "You looked right at them." "I had something to say." "Harry, there were 3 cut crane supports," Harry said. That needed to be said quickly before anyone started talking about structural failure or maintenance issues, because whoever did it would use those 48 hours to bury the evidence. He watched his father's expression. "I know you've made choices about what you show the world and what you don't. I respect those choices. They're yours to make." He crossed the kitchen and opened the fridge and took out the orange juice. "Mine are mine." Clark stood very still. "I'm not going to hide what I am," Harry said, pouring a glass. "I'm not going to be someone who could hold up a building and chooses to let people die inside it because the PR situation is complicated." He looked at his father over the glass. "I know you know that. I know you feel the same way. I think you're scared for me and it's coming out as concern about the cameras." Clark looked at his son. Then he let out a breath, a long, slow one, and sat down on one of the kitchen stools. "You're 16, he said. "You were younger when you started. That's not a point in favor of either of us." Harry smiled. He sat down across from his father. Between them, the kitchen was warm and ordinary breakfast things still on the counter from earlier, the city filling the windows behind Clark's head. "I'm going to be visible," Harry said. "That's a decision I've made. Not because I want the attention, you know I don't, but because visible is honest, and I'm done with the version of things where the people who are supposed to protect you hide what's actually happening." He paused. "Also, practically speaking, people in the harbor needed help and I was there." The idea of watching that and waiting for a better moment I couldn't do it. Clark looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I know," he said softly. "I know you couldn't. I'm not you," Harry said. "But I'm your son. I'm going to do what you do, which is help people and not apologize for it. I'm just going to be." He searched for the word. "Louder about it," Clark said with a faint smile. "I was going to say honest, but sure, louder works." Lois arrived home at 9, with the expression of a woman who had been tracking a story about defense contracts, and had just watched her son appear on every major news network, and made a real-time editorial decision to pivot. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking between Harry and Clark, with the intense journalistic assessment of someone taking an instant mental photograph for reference. Then she walked in, set her bag down, poured herself a coffee, and said, "You held up a warehouse." "Part of one," Harry said, "while standing in harbor water. The water part was earlier, for the cars. And then you looked at the camera and told them it was a crime scene." "Because it was." Lois sat down. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "The Metropolis PD confirmed the crane supports," she said. "Cut with something that left a thermal signature consistent with energy-based tools. Military grade, probably. My source at the precinct says the FBI is already involved." She looked at Harry. "Good call." "Lois," Clark said. "He was right," she said simply. "That's not negotiable, Clark. He was right. And if he'd kept his mouth shut, whoever did it would have had a 48-hour head start, and they wouldn't have found anything." She looked at her husband with the expression of a woman who had made peace with the extraordinary long ago and was occasionally impatient with those still catching up. "Our son held up a building and then used the news camera to flag evidence at a crime scene. He was helpful and he was smart. I'm not going to make him feel bad about that." Clark opened his mouth, closed it, said, "I wasn't." "You were a little bit," Lois said. A silence. Then Harry laughed, quiet and genuine, and Clark made a sound that was almost a laugh but was mostly resignation. And Lois looked between them with the expression of a woman in a life she'd chosen completely. "Now," she said, pulling out her phone. "The camera footage is everywhere and people are asking questions, so we should probably talk about what we want the shape of this to be. Because you just became a public figure, Harrison, and public figures need to be ahead of the story." "I don't want a name," Harry said immediately. "A name, a cape name, a symbol, a brand." He shook his head. "Dad has Superman, I understand why. The brand creates a box, and the box creates expectations, and the expectations create predictability, which helps people feel safer." He turned his mug in his hands. "I don't want a box. I want to just be. Harrison Kent helps people and has magic and can fly, and if the world wants to think something about that, fine, but I'm not wearing a cape." Lois and Clark exchanged a look over his head. The look contained about 15 years of marriage and the specific fluency of two people who'd spent those years adjacent to the extraordinary. "Your father tried something similar when he started," Lois said carefully. "I know, the glasses." "Yes, the glasses were, I mean." Harry paused diplomatically. "You can say it," Clark said. "The glasses were not exactly a sophisticated intelligence operation, Dad. It worked for 20 years. Differently," Harry said. "The world is different now. There are more people like you. The world has already reconfigured its expectations." He looked at Clark steadily. "I'm not going to pretend to be someone else. I'm Harrison Kent. My dad is Superman. Anyone who looks at the footage from this morning and the family photo on Mum's Instagram from last summer is going to figure it out inside a week, and I'm fine with that." Clark stared at him. "I'm fine with that," Harry said again, patiently. "I've been two people before, I mean that literally, and it didn't help me. I'm not going to be two people again." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Somewhere in the building below them, a dog was barking at the elevator. Through the big windows, the city glittered and moved and didn't stop. Clark nodded, slowly. "Okay," he said. The footage ran on loop all day. By noon, it had 40 million views. By 3, it had 120. By 7 that evening, Harrison Kent was trending in 36 countries. The harbor rescue was the top story on every major outlet. And Lex Luthor, in his office on the 54th floor of the LexCorp building with a view of half the city, was watching the same 30-second clip for what his assistant could confirm was the 11th time. He had a tablet in his hand and a glass of water he hadn't touched, and the expression of a man who had just received information that rearranged something fundamental. "Run it again," he said. His assistant, who had been standing near the door for the past 2 hours and had the Constitution for it because the job required the Constitution for it, ran it again. The clip showed Harry walking out of the water. It showed him addressing the officer with a clarity and specificity that didn't look like someone running on adrenaline. It looked like someone thinking clearly under pressure, which was its own kind of remarkable. And then, this was the part Lex kept returning to. Just before Harry looked directly at the camera, there was a half-second where the air around him did something. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but Lex's analysts had run enhancement algorithms on the frame, and there it was. A faint luminance, blue-white, the kind of light that didn't come from Kryptonian solar absorption or any known metahuman energy signature in the League database. It came from nowhere in the known physics of superpowered biology. "He's Superman's son," Lex said. "The DNA confirmation. I don't need a confirmation. Look at the jaw. Look at the eyes." Lex set the tablet down. "But the eyes are wrong. Superman's eyes are blue. The mother's are brown. This boy has green eyes, and that's not a straightforward Punnett square outcome." He turned from the screen. "And that light. What did imaging say about the light? The spectral analysis doesn't match any known energy type. It's in the same frequency range as..." His assistant checked the tablet. "There are actually no known frequency-matched entries." Lex was quiet for a moment. He stood at his window and looked at the city, at the harbor district where the crane wreckage was still visible from here, and he thought. He was a man of specific and genuine convictions. He believed, in the deep and non-negotiable way that people believe things they've spent their life building a philosophy around, that the natural human capacity for growth, invention, and self-determination was the most valuable thing that existed. He believed that dependence on beings of incomprehensible power, beings who operated by their own ethics and answered to no one and could, on any given Tuesday, decide that their judgment superseded the collective judgment of 8 billion humans, was an existential civilizational risk. He didn't hate Superman. He was afraid of what Superman represented. A world that couldn't protect itself from its own protectors. And now there was a boy, 16 years old, son of the most powerful being on Earth, with an additional ability that didn't fit any known model and a pair of green eyes that looked at cameras with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided they weren't going to hide. Lex turned from the window. "Get me everything on Harrison Kent," he said. "School records, medical. The farmhouse in Smallville has been flagged by 3 separate monitoring services for anomalous readings over the past decade. I want all of that. And I want Dr. Irons on the phone." "Which project should I cite for the resource allocation?" "Start a new one," Lex said. "Call it whatever you want, but I want it well-funded and I want it yesterday." He picked up the tablet again and looked at the green-eyed boy standing in harbor water looking directly at a camera, and the expression on Lex Luthor's face was not cruelty and was not hatred and was not the expression of a villain moving pieces on a board. It was the expression of a man who was genuinely, profoundly afraid, working very hard to do something useful with that fear. The school the next day was a different climate. Harry had expected this. His classmates had his level of social complexity he'd need to navigate, and he moved through it with the ease of someone who had once navigated the social ecosystem of a British boarding school, full of people who thought either he was lying about being the chosen one, or that he was going to get them all killed. So Metropolis High's particular flavors of awe and awkward were genuinely manageable. Tam sat down next to him in physics and said, without preamble, "You held up a building." "Part of one," Harry said. "You're going to keep saying part of one, aren't you? It was structurally significant, the part I held up." Tam looked at him for a long moment. She had a very good look, the kind that assessed rather than gawked. "Are you okay?" she asked. Harry looked at her. It was a real question, and she was asking it like a real question, not fishing for a dramatic revelation or angling toward the interesting story. Just, "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." "Okay," she said. "Good." She opened her physics textbook. "I've been thinking about the harmonic resonance thing you mentioned last week, the interference pattern between different energy types. I think I have a mathematical model." Harry raised an eyebrow. He'd mentioned the energy harmonic thing in the context of something abstract, or what he'd presented as abstract. "How much of that did you work out from first principles?" "Most of it." She slid her notebook over, 3 pages of dense equations. Harry looked at the equations. He looked at Tam. "You've been thinking about this a lot." "I'm observant," she said simply. "You want to look over it." He pulled the notebook toward him and started reading, and the morning moved forward around them, and it was ordinary in the way that the day after a seismic event is sometimes ordinary, a bit more vivid at the edges, a bit more awake, but recognizably itself. Celia found him at lunch. She sat across from him in the corner of the cafeteria, just the two of them, her journalist's notebook nowhere in sight, and she said, "I'm not going to write about you." "I didn't ask you not to," Harry said. "I know, I'm telling you anyway." She looked at him steadily. "You're my friend," or a pause. "I think you're my friend, I'm telling you as that." "Thank you," Harry said, simply. She nodded, picked up her fork. Then, "The cut crane supports. My mom covered the FBI briefing this morning. They're saying the thermal signature matches a proprietary tool that was reported stolen from an LexCorp subsidiary 9 months ago." Harry was very still. "That's public record," Celia said. "As of an hour ago, so I'm not—" "I know," Harry said. "You're not telling me anything that isn't public." He looked at her. "What's your read?" "Either LexCorp got robbed and is genuinely not involved," she said, "or the theft was staged and it's a layer of deniability." She paused. "My read is the second one, but I have no evidence." "Neither do I," Harry said. They ate in comfortable silence for a moment. The cafeteria moved around them, loud and ordinary. "Harry," Celia said. "Yeah, yesterday at the harbor, that light, around you just for a second." She was looking at him with that direct, careful attention. "That wasn't your dad's thing, was it? That was something else." Harry met her eyes. He made a decision in the quiet way he made most of the important ones. "No," he said. "That was something else." "Okay," she said, and she let it sit there without pushing it, and he was once again impressed by her. He flew home that evening above the clouds, above the city, in the narrow strip of altitude between the commercial flight paths and the weather systems. And he thought about Lex Luthor's building in the skyline below him and Celia's words at lunch, and the questions that were beginning to accumulate with the specific density of things that weren't going to stay theoretical much longer. The resonance was still there, still present at the edges of his perception, that low hum of the world's magic doing something geological and slow, getting incrementally stronger. He'd been tracking it for 3 years, and the trend line was clear. Whatever was coming, it was coming on a timetable, and the timetable was probably months now rather than years. He hung in the cold air above Metropolis and looked at the stars, which were invisible through the light pollution below but present and real above the cloud layer, and he did something he almost never did. He was still and quiet and let himself feel the whole complicated weight of his situation. 2 lives, 2 inheritances. A father who was Superman, a mother who was the best journalist in the country, a city that had just watched him walk out of a harbor, a man in a tower who was already looking at camera footage with the wrong kind of focus, and somewhere beyond the edge of the world, a thinning door between universes. He held all of it for a moment, didn't try to solve it, didn't file it away, just felt it. Then he took a breath. Then he went home for dinner. Chapter 3. Echoes across the veil, the rift opened on a Thursday. Harry was on the roof of the apartment building, not doing anything dramatic, just sitting with his back against the water tower with a thermos of tea and his notebook, tracking the resonance patterns he'd been mapping since 13. He'd developed a notation system for it, half borrowed from the Arcanum's existing magical cartography and half invented, that let him represent the way the energy moved through the world's magical substrate the way you'd represent weather on a pressure map. Isobars of the impossible. The pattern had shifted overnight. He'd noticed it when he woke up at 4 a.m. with the feeling of a sound that was just below hearing, the kind that vibrated in your back teeth. He'd lain in the dark for 10 minutes cataloging it and then given up on sleep and come up to the roof. The December cold didn't touch him. He sat cross-legged and wrote, and the city spread out below him in all its pre-dawn half-life, a few lit windows, the garbage trucks doing their early rounds, the sky to the east beginning its slow argument with the dark. He felt the rift before it opened. 5 seconds of warning, a pressure change, a quality of wrongness in the air that his magic recognized the way you recognize a familiar smell. And then the sky above West Metropolis tore open like something had dragged a fingernail across it. Not dramatically, not with fire or lightning or the particular cinematics that crises in his city tended toward. It was more like a seam coming undone, a line of light that wasn't light, silver white and wrong, about 40 feet long and 30 feet above the Centennial Park tree line, hanging in the cold morning air like a wound that hadn't decided what it was yet. And through it, falling, a person. Harry was off the roof in the same second. He caught her 20 feet above the park lawn, arms under her before she hit, and the landing was harder than he liked, because she'd been in mid-fall and the physics of intercepting a falling object meant absorbing momentum rather than eliminating it. But he angled them into the grass and took the impact and rolled, and came up standing in the frost-stiff December lawn with a girl in his arms, dark-skinned, dark-haired, bushy-haired in a way that was specific and unmistakable. Wearing Hogwarts robes that were modern-cut but unmistakably Hogwarts, and a wand clutched so hard in her right fist that her knuckles were pale. Harry stood very still. The girl opened her eyes. They were brown and sharp and immediately, intensely present, not the dazed quality of someone who just nearly died, but the very specific alertness of someone who had trained themselves to snap back from shock because shock was a luxury she decided she couldn't afford. She looked at the metropolis skyline behind him. She looked at the park. She looked at him. She said, "This isn't the Ministry." "No," Harry said. "It's Centennial Park, Metropolis." Her eyes went very still. "Metropolis," she said. "I caught you," he said. "About 20 feet up, you're okay." She looked at him again. At his face, specifically, not the way people looked at Harry Kent when they recognized Clark's son, but the way someone looks at a face they've been seeing in the peripheral vision of their memory and are now suddenly confronting directly. Her expression did something complicated and quickly controlled, the practiced emotional management of someone who had spent years not showing things in public. "I know who you are," she whispered. "I know who you are too," Harry said. Hermione Granger burst into tears. He gave her 20 seconds. He was good at that, the patience of standing in someone else's storm without trying to redirect it immediately, something he'd learned young and valued. He set her down gently on her feet, kept his hands on her shoulders until she had her balance, and when she pressed both fists against her eyes and pulled herself together in the specific way that Hermione had always pulled herself together, through sheer disciplined will, the same mechanism she used for everything, he took a step back and let her have the space. "Sorry," she said. Her voice was steady again, the professional composure of someone who'd trained it back into place. "Don't be," he said. "You just fell through dimensional space. I think that earns some leeway." She looked at him. 26, he guessed. She'd been 2 years older in the other life, so if that age mapping translated at all, with the bearing of someone who'd been in positions of authority long enough that authority had stopped feeling like something she had to earn. She looked at him with Hermione's eyes, sharp and analytical and doing about 15 things at once. "You're different," she said. "Different from what?" "Different from..." She hesitated. "I've been running calculations on dimensional convergence for 3 years. The thinning in the veil. We've been tracking it from our side. The mathematics kept pointing here." She glanced at the rift above the park, which was already narrowing, the seam pulling itself closed with the slow reluctance of a wound healing. "I followed the resonance signature. I didn't exactly plan the falling part. What does the resonance signature look like from your side?" She blinked. Not at the question's content, but at its precision, the question of someone who already had a framework, already understood the underlying physics of what she was asking about. Like something on the other side has been broadcasting, not intentionally, just existing," Harry said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He turned and looked at the rift. It was down to about 10 feet of seam now, almost gone. He raised his hand and touched the edge of it with 2 fingers, feeling the dimensional membrane the way you'd feel a fault line in a wall, the specific texture of something that was stressed and fragile and needed care. He could probably keep it open if he wanted. He could probably, with enough effort, make it bigger. He let it close. "Come on," he said. "Let's get off the park lawn before the morning joggers arrive. I'll make tea." Hermione looked at him. Then she looked at the space where the rift had been. Then she looked back at him. "You can feel the dimensional membrane," she said, like she was confirming something. "I've been able to feel it for 3 years," Harry said, starting toward the park path. She followed him, and he could hear from her footsteps the specific quality of someone processing a great deal of information very quickly and doing it on the move. "Okay," she said. "Tea, right. And then you need to explain to me how. How are you here? How are you anything? Because we buried Harry Potter 4 years ago, and I thought..." Her voice did something that wasn't quite steady. "I thought it was over." "Not quite," Harry said. He took her back to the apartment. Clark was already gone. He had an early meeting in Washington, something league-related, and Lois had left a note saying she was at the office by 7, call if needed. Harry had the place to himself, which was ideal. Hermione sat at the kitchen table and looked at the metropolis skyline through the big windows with the expression of someone continually updating their understanding of where they were. And Harry made tea, real tea, the kind that required a pot, not bags. He'd learned this young and maintained it with some conviction, and brought it to the table and sat down across from her. He told his story the same way he'd told it to Clark and Lois. Clean, direct, not lingering in the painful parts longer than was useful. But he watched her face while he told it, and her face was doing something different from what Clark's had done or what Lois's had done. Clark had felt horror and love and fury. Lois had felt horror and strategic focus. Hermione felt something that was closer to grief with a knife in it, grief complicated by something she was not yet ready to name, something that pulled at the corners of her eyes and tightened her jaw and that she kept pressing down with visible effort. When he got to the end, the curse in the back, the direction of it, Dumbledore's voice, she was very still. "He said it is done," Harry said. "Silence, Hermione. I knew." Her voice was controlled in the way of something under enormous pressure being controlled. "Not that I didn't know he would," she stopped, pressed her hand flat on the table like she was steadying herself. "I knew he was hiding something I'd known for a year before, the way he was positioning you in the last months, the way he stopped arguing with the people in the order who said you'd have to." She closed her eyes. "I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that I trusted him and that his judgment had never..." "He was very convincing," Harry said. "That's not an excuse." "No," Harry said. "It's not, but it's a reason." She looked at him. The grief with a knife expression had shifted into something rower, something that didn't have the veneer of control over it. "I've had 4 years to think about what I should have done differently," she said. "I could have if I had said something, if I had pushed. Maybe," Harry said. "Maybe not, Hermione." He waited until she met his eyes. "I am not angry at you. You should be. Maybe, but I'm not." He poured more tea into her cup. "I'm not angry at you because you were 22 years old and you were fighting a war, and you trusted the person who was supposed to be the wisest man in the room. I was angry at Dumbledore for a long time. I'm something past that now, something quieter." He looked at his own hands wrapped around the mug. "I'm alive, I'm here, I have good parents in a city I like, and honestly more power than I know what to do with, which is a good problem to have." He looked up. "I don't want your guilt, I genuinely don't need it." Hermione was quiet for a long time. The city moved in the windows behind her. "He believed it, you know," she said finally. "Dumbledore. I spent a long time after. I went through his papers, what the ministry let me access, what Minerva kept. He genuinely believed that you had to die, that the maths of it were inexorable and that any alternative was just wishful thinking that would cost more lives." A pause. "He was wrong. There were at least 3 other approaches I found in his own notes that he dismissed as too uncertain. He chose the one that sacrificed you because he believed your life was already forfeit and he didn't want to risk the alternatives." "I know," Harry said. "He loved you," Hermione said, "in his way." "I know that too." Harry's voice was even. It didn't help. "Love that turns you into a tool is a specific kind of damage, but I know he believed it was love." He shrugged, a small, real gesture. He was brilliant and he was terrible and he was probably the most genuinely complex person in that whole world. And he's been dead for 4 years and I'm having tea in Metropolis. I think I win. Something crossed Hermione's face that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. You're so different, she said. You're Harry but you're not, you're so certain. I had to grow up fast in the other life, Harry said. In this one I got to grow up properly. Clark and Lois are, he paused, looking for the right word. Good, he said simply. They're just genuinely good people, it changes you. Hermione looked at him. Then she looked at the apartment, the ordinary warmth of it, the family photos on the refrigerator, the reading glasses left on the counter, the bookshelf with Clark's journalism texts beside Lois's notebooks beside Harry's complete collection of Arcanum research materials, and one very well-worn copy of Hogwarts. A history that he'd sourced from this universe's equivalent printing, because old habits died hard. She stood up from the table and walked to the bookshelf and looked at the Hogwarts book. She didn't take it down, just looked at it. What do you want from me? She asked, not unkindly, just directly. I want to know why you're here, Harry said. Not the how, I understand the resonance mechanics. I mean why. You could have sent a probe. You could have built a monitoring device. You came yourself. She was quiet for a moment. Because I needed to know if you were real, she said. And I needed to. She turned from the bookshelf. Her expression was clear and somewhat raw. I needed to apologize. I know you said you're not angry, and I believe you, but I need to say it anyway. For myself. Okay, Harry said. I'm sorry, Hermione Granger said. I should have pushed harder. I should have looked at what Dumbledore was doing with clearer eyes, and I should have. Hermione. His voice was gentle. I hear you, and it's okay. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. Okay, she said. Now sit back down and tell me about the resonance from your side. Because something is happening between the dimensions, and from where I'm standing it looks like it's accelerating. She came back to the table, and the conversation shifted, and they talked for 2 hours in the cold December morning in the Metropolis apartment. And it was the kind of conversation that only happens between two people who share an enormous and specific context, fast and associative, finishing each other's logical chains, arguing efficiently when they disagreed, which was often, and building something genuinely useful out of the collision. Clark came home at noon and stopped in the apartment doorway. Harry looked up. Dad, this is Hermione Granger. She's from the other universe. She fell through the rift this morning. Clark looked at Hermione. He looked at Harry. He came inside and set down his bag with the careful deliberateness of a man who was filing several strong reactions under later. Hermione Granger, he said. Mr. Kent, Hermione said. She stood, which was probably instinct. She had the bearing of someone who stood for people in authority and then internally clocked that instinct and sometimes overrode it. I know this is unusual. Harry's brought home unusual before, Clark said. He extended his hand, and Hermione shook it, and Clark's expression shifted into something warmer, the specifically Clark Kent brand of warmth that Harry had grown up with, the warmth of a person who had decided to lead with trust until given specific reason not to. How did you find him? Dimensional resonance, Harry said. He's been broadcasting, Hermione said simultaneously. They looked at each other. I said it first, Harry said. I said it earlier, Hermione said. This morning, on the park lawn. Clark sat down at the kitchen table with the expression of a man watching something very familiar happen in a completely new form. You argue like siblings, he said. Both Harry and Hermione opened their mouths, closed them. Harry looked at the ceiling. Hermione looked at her tea. Anyway, Harry said. Lois came home at 3 and handled the development with full Lois velocity. A brief moment of sharp assessment, a handshake, and then the yellow legal pad came out and Hermione, who had lived with journalists long enough in her own universe to recognize the energy of someone who was going to ask good questions whether you wanted them to or not, answered with efficient honesty. They were still at the table at 6 when the thing Harry had been half expecting arrived. Not the rift that had closed. Something else. A knock at the apartment door that was too measured to be casual, and behind the door, when Clark looked through the wall with a brief flicker of vision, two people in plain clothes standing with the specific posture of federal agents, and behind them, not touching the wall, standing slightly apart with the expression of a man who had decided to be personally present because the situation warranted personal presence, Lex Luthor. Harry stood up from the table. Clark caught his eye. "You don't have to." Harry shook his head slightly. He walked to the door and opened it. The two agents had their credentials out before he'd fully opened it. FBI, which matched Celia's information from the week before. Behind them, Lex stood in a coat that had probably cost more than the average monthly rent in the Sullivan district, his expression calibrated to something that walked the line between professional and personal in the way of a man who wanted you to read it both ways simultaneously. "Harrison Kent," Lex said. "Mr. Luthor," Harry said. "I was hoping for a conversation." Harry looked at the two agents. He looked back at Lex. There was a moment where he could feel everyone in the apartment behind him, Clark's controlled tension, Lois's alert stillness, Hermione's hand probably somewhere near her wand, and he felt none of his own tension at all, which was interesting and worth examining later. "Come in," Harry said. He stepped back from the door. "Your agents can wait in the hall." Lex's expression moved almost imperceptibly. He looked at Harry, at the ease of him, the specific quality of someone who was not intimidated, and was not performing not being intimidated, was just genuinely not. And then he looked at Clark, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was doing several things at once. "Kent," Lex said to Clark, not unfriendly, the complex specific unfriendliness of a long history. "Lex," Clark said, "I'm not here about you." He looked back at Harry. "I'm here about him." "I know," Harry said. "Sit down." They sat. Lois sat at the end of the table and did not pretend she wasn't recording on her phone, which Lex acknowledged with a faint smile that respected the move. Hermione had disappeared into the kitchen, which Harry took as her being either tactfully absent or strategically positioned, and knowing Hermione, probably the latter. Lex looked at Harry across the table with the expression Harry had identified from the camera footage, the intelligent fear being channeled into purpose, the genuine concern dressed up as assessment. "The harbor," Lex said. "The crane supports were cut with a tool stolen from one of your subsidiaries," Harry said. "I'm aware. I want you to know I have every intention of cooperating fully with the federal investigation." Lex's voice was measured, absolutely controlled without sounding controlled. "The theft was real, Mr. Kent. I would not be so artless." "I believe you," Harry said. Lex paused slightly at this. He'd been expecting more resistance. "You do. You're a man with convictions," Harry said. "You're not stupid enough to stage a theft that obvious and then use the tool in a way that gets traced back in 48 hours. If you wanted to attack a port facility, you'd do it better than that." Harry met his eyes. "Whoever did it wanted it traced back to you. Framing is still a motive structure I should consider, but for the moment, yes, I believe the theft was real." Lex regarded him with an expression Harry had seen before on different faces, the expression of someone recalibrating. "You're 16 years old," Lex said. "So people keep mentioning. It's contextually significant." "I've had some relevant experience," Harry said. He let the ambiguity of that sit there. Lex looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clark, then back at Harry, and the expression shifted into the version of itself that was closer to honesty. "I'll be direct," he said. "The harbor was not why I came. I came because of the footage, the light in the footage. I know. It's not Kryptonian. Number, it doesn't match any known metahuman classification. Also, number, what is it?" Lex asked. The question stripped clean of anything except genuine desire to understand. Harry looked at him. He felt the weight of the choice, not the fear of it, just the weight. What he told Lex Luthor now would shape a relationship that was clearly going to be significant, and he had learned in 2 lifetimes that the shape of relationships depended more on how they started than on how you managed them afterward. "Magic," Harry said, a silence. "That's not a scientific." "I know what it's not," Harry said. "It's magic, real, functional, learnable magic. It operates through a distinct energy substrate that exists alongside the physical universe. interacts with it in specific and reproducible ways, and I have had it since before I was born. He held Lex's gaze. I can demonstrate if you need me to, but I'd rather you just take my word for it and we move to the interesting part. Lex looked at him. His expression had arrived at something that was close to the surface, the philosophical crisis that Harry had identified from the camera footage, the specific vertigo of a worldview being tested by new data. He was a scientist at his core, regardless of everything else he was. Data was data. Magic, Lex said again, almost to himself. And Kryptonian, Harry said, both simultaneously in the same body. He paused. I know what you're thinking. Do you? You're thinking about what that means for your framework. A being that combines physical power that already operates outside human parameters with an energy system that doesn't interact with Kryptonian weaknesses. You're doing the threat assessment. Harry's voice was not hostile. It was simply accurate. I'm going to tell you what you won't find in the threat assessment, which is that I don't want to rule anything. I want to help people and be left alone to do it. Those two things are genuinely compatible, and I've organized my life around them. Lex leaned forward slightly. The difference between your intentions and your capabilities becomes irrelevant the moment your intentions change. That's true of everyone, Harry said, including you. He tilted his head. The difference, Mr. Luther, is that people like my father and I have chosen to make ourselves visible and accountable, while people in positions of significant human power, political, financial, industrial, operate with considerably less transparency and considerably more immediate influence over human life and death. A pause. I'm not saying that to be combative. I'm saying it because your threat framework applies asymmetrically, and I think you know that. Clark was very still in the kitchen doorway. Lois had stopped pretending to be merely present and was watching the table with undisguised focus. Lex sat back. He looked at Harry with an expression that was the closest thing to respect that a man like Lex Luthor offered in first meetings, which was a kind of careful, charged acknowledgement that he was sitting across from someone who would require taking seriously. You're not what I expected, Lex said. What did you expect? Clark Kent's son. Which would mean, my father's values and none of his practice of them. Harry smiled, and it was a slightly sharp smile, not unkind but pointed. I have his values. I practice them differently. A pause. My father was raised to be humble about what he was, which I think came from love and served some good purposes but also had costs. I was raised, he glanced at Clark for a fraction of a second, to be honest about what I am. Lex looked between them. And what are you? He asked, not as a challenge, as an actual question from a man trying to understand. Harry thought about it for a moment, not performing the thought, actually taking the question seriously. I'm someone who's died once and lived twice, he said, and I have no interest in letting either of those lives be wasted. He met Lex's eyes. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Luther, but I'm also not going to manage myself down to a size that makes you comfortable. Those are two separate things, and I'd like you to hold them separately. Lex looked at him for a long, quiet moment, then he stood up. He buttoned his coat. He looked at Clark. Your son, he said, and there was something in the inflection that was not quite any single emotion but contained several of them layered. Yeah, Clark said. Lex nodded once. He looked back at Harry. I'll be watching, he said. I know, Harry said. That's fine. Lex left. The agents went with him. The door closed on the quiet apartment and on a silence that lasted about 3 seconds before Lois said, Harry, that was either the most effective opening negotiation I've ever watched, or we just made a very powerful enemy. Both, Harry said, but mostly the first one. He turned from the door. He respects directness. He spent years dealing with my father's. Chosen opacity, Clark said, with the expression of a man who had made peace with the characterization while finding it personally uncomfortable. I was going to say restraint, Harry said. But yes, Lex doesn't know how to have a real conversation with someone who won't engage directly with his actual concerns, so he defaults to threat assessment. I gave him an actual conversation. Hermione appeared from the kitchen doorway. She had her notepad, and she'd clearly been in there taking notes, which made Harry feel a great warmth toward her because of course she had been. He's going to develop a counter to your abilities, she said. That's where this leads. Probably, Harry said. You don't seem concerned. I'm appropriately concerned, Harry said. Which means I've noted it, I'll prepare for it, and in the meantime I have other things to deal with. He looked at her. Like the resonance. I need you to tell me what the thinning looks like from your side now. In detail. Because from this side it looks like it's building toward a single event, and I need to know how close the event horizon is. Hermione put her notepad on the table. Close, she said. I've been running the models for 6 months. The convergence point is, I think it's within the year. What does convergence mean? Clark asked. He came fully into the room for the first time in the conversation, sat down at the table, his full attention on Hermione. It means the membrane between universes reaches a thinning threshold where energy exchange between them becomes natural and difficult to stop, Hermione said. Magical energy, specifically. The substrate that magic operates on exists in both universes, and the universes they're harmonically linked in a way that isn't fully understood, but my best model suggests they were originally a single construct that split. She looked at Harry. Which would explain why a magical core could survive transition between them. It came with me, Harry said quietly. Through the void. Because the void between them isn't empty, Hermione said. It's the membrane itself, and the membrane is partially composed of magical substrate. Your core held its shape because it was moving through compatible territory. Like water through water, Clark said. Hermione looked at him slightly differently, the specific look of someone recalibrating their expectations of a person. Exactly like that. What happens at convergence? Harry asked. The energy exchange becomes bidirectional and uncontrolled, Hermione said. Magical energy flooding into this universe in quantities that the people here aren't equipped to process. Non-magical people here could, she paused. Some of them might manifest abilities, some might be harmed. There's no way to predict who responds how because there's no magical history here to build a model from, no generations of exposure, no. It would be indiscriminate, Harry said. Yes. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the December city moved in its endless, ordinary way. 23 floors of apartment building below them. 16 million people in the metro area going about their Thursday afternoon. Harry sat with the weight of this information and didn't try to immediately solve it because some information needed to be held before it could be used properly. He could feel Hermione watching him do this. She'd always understood that particular quality of his, the thinking by sitting, still that everyone else always mistook for him being slow when it was actually the opposite. I can stabilize it, he said. The membrane. I've been touching the edges of it for 3 years. I understand its texture. He looked at his hands. I'd need time and I'd need information from both sides simultaneously, which means... You need me here, Hermione said. Yes. I can't stay indefinitely. The dimensional bridge I used is closed and building a stable one that doesn't require. I can open one, Harry said. She looked at him. You can open a stable dimensional bridge. I haven't done it on purpose before, Harry admitted. But I understand the mechanics well enough in theory. And I have. He glanced at his hands again, at the invisible thing that ran beneath the surface of him. I have the right kind of substrate access. My magic is interfaced with the Kryptonian biology, which means I have more raw capacity than a standard magical practitioner. The limiting factor was never ability. It was knowledge of what to do with it. And now you have someone who might supply the knowledge, Hermione said. If you're willing. She looked at him across the table. This boy who had been her best friend, who had been shaped by people she hadn't protected him from, who had died and come back and grown up into someone she was still figuring out how to place in her taxonomy of known people. She looked at his green eyes, which were Harry's eyes and also not, because Harry's eyes had always contained a question and these contained an answer. Yes, she said. I'm willing. That evening, Harry went to the roof again. The December air was thick and cold, and the city was moving into its night patterns below him. He sat on the edge with his legs over and his hands loose in his lap, and felt the membrane, distant and vast and stressed, like a drumhead stretched too tight, vibrating at a frequency that his magic heard the way you hear a sound you recognize from a dream. He thought about Dumbledore, not with the old grief, not even with the old anger, with something more like understanding. Not forgiveness, because forgiveness implied he was carrying something that needed to be set down, and he'd set it down a long time ago in the dark of the Kent farmhouse bedroom. But understanding. A brilliant man who had believed the math of sacrifice was simpler than it was. Who had not considered that some variables, love, specifically, and the specific quality of a person who had survived by not dying, who kept finding ways to be alive in impossible circumstances, don't simplify nicely. He'd survived Voldemort's first curse at 15 months old. He'd survived Dumbledore's plan. He'd survived death itself and come back with everything that mattered intact. He didn't consider that remarkable. It was just the pattern of his existence. He was constitutionally unsuited to staying dead, and the universe had apparently decided to work with that rather than against it. He heard footsteps behind him, light, careful, someone who had grown up being quiet so as not to disturb the people who had power over them, which was a habit he recognized because he'd had the same one once. He didn't turn around. Hermione sat down next to him on the roof edge. She sat like she used to at the Gryffindor table, upright, precise, even on a roof ledged 23 stories up. "I keep thinking," she said, "about what he would say if he could." Dumbledore. Yes. He'd say it was necessary, Harry said. He'd say the greater good. He'd probably say he was sorry in the way of someone who was sorry for the pain but not for the choice. He paused. And he'd be telling the truth about all of it. That's the thing about him. He was never lying. He was just operating from a framework that had a fundamental flaw built into it. What flaw? That he knew better. Harry looked at the city. He was the smartest person in most rooms he ever entered. That does things to your philosophy. You start to believe that your judgment is so good that you don't need to consult the people your judgments affect. He shrugged. Classic problem, not limited to wizards. Hermione was quiet for a moment. "What you said to Luther earlier," she said, "about being honest about what you are." "Yeah. I've spent the last 4 years in the ministry," she said. "In the structure, working from inside it, trying to change things." A pause. "I've gotten some things done. I've also been," she stopped. "I've been managing myself down to a size that makes the system comfortable with me." Harry said nothing. Let it develop. "I thought that was how you worked within institutions," she said. "You become legible to them. You work in their language. And I'm sitting on a rooftop in Metropolis with the person they used as a weapon," she said. "And I'm wondering if I've been doing the same thing they did to you to myself, willingly." Her voice was careful. The voice of someone examining something they'd invested a great deal in. Using the framework that the people in power provided because it was the available framework. Harry looked at her. She was staring at the city, not at him. "You're one of the smartest people I've ever known," he said. "In either life. Harry, I mean it, not as a compliment to set up a butt, just as a fact." He paused. "You've always known things before other people and then waited for other people to catch up because you'd learned early that being right too fast makes people defensive." He tilted his head. "You don't have to do that here. You can just be what you are." She finally looked at him. "You've built a life that fits you," he said. "A real one with good parents and a city and enough power to matter. I want that for you too." Hermione was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're very different." "You've said that. I keep needing to say it." A pause that had something lighter in it. Ron would have said something profoundly unhelpful at this point. Harry laughed. It came out surprised, which was the best kind. He really would have. "He's good," she said. "He's got kids, 3. He coaches their Quidditch league every weekend." "Of course he does. He's going to lose his mind when I tell him." "Tell him I said hi," Harry said. "And that Gryffindor's seeker was always better than Slytherin's." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, the first one she'd produced since she'd fallen out of the sky that morning, and it sounded like relief with sound attached. They sat on the roof together in the December cold, and let the city hold them for a while. 2 people from the same impossible history, sitting in a new universe looking at different stars than the ones they'd started under. And below them, Metropolis hummed and moved and didn't stop for any of it, which was exactly what they needed it to do. Chapter 4. The weight of 2 worlds 3 weeks after Hermione fell out of the sky, Lex Luthor made his move. Harry knew it was coming. He'd known the moment Lex left the apartment, had read the specific quality of the man's exit, the way his gaze had catalogued the room one final time before turning away, the small pause at the door that wasn't hesitation but was inventory. Lex Luthor did not leave situations. He gathered information and returned to his fortress and built something with it. That was his fundamental nature, and Harry respected it the same way you respect a force of weather, not by loving it, but by understanding its mechanics well enough not to be caught unprepared. He'd told Hermione within the hour. She'd pulled out her notepad and said, "What kind of counter do you think?" And they'd spent the evening building a threat matrix on the kitchen table that was equal parts magical theory and Kryptonian physics, cross-referenced with Hermione's considerable research on Harrison's energy profile, which she'd apparently been developing from across the dimensional divide for 2 years. Clark had looked at the threat matrix the next morning. He'd been quiet for a moment. Then he'd said, "You know, when I was your age, I didn't start planning for attacks until someone had actually attacked me." "How'd that work out?" Harry asked. Clark thought about it. "Mixed results." "Right," Harry said, and went back to the threat matrix. What they produced was a working model of the most viable counter-strategies available to a man with Lex Luthor's resources. The Kryptonian angles were predictable, the kryptonite approaches, the red sun radiation, the existing arsenal that Lex had spent decades refining against Clark. Harry had Kryptonian biology, but he wasn't Clark, and the specific differences mattered. Clark's cells were fully solar-saturated, decades of Earth's yellow sun absorption layered deep into his physiology. Harry was 16 with a body that had been storing solar energy for 16 years in a Kryptonian chassis that was still developing. Some of the standard counters would hit him differently. The magic angle was harder to model. Because nobody, not Lex, not the Arcanum, not Hermione with all her research, fully understood the interference pattern that happened when you tried to apply a counter to someone whose magic and Kryptonian physiology had been in dialogue with each other since birth. The two systems had been negotiating for 16 years and had developed something that wasn't quite either. Harry's best metaphor was alloy, neither of the original metals, but something with different properties than both. He was genuinely curious to find out what Lex had come up with. It happened on a Tuesday morning 2 days before Christmas. Harry was in the kitchen eating breakfast when his hearing picked up the first wrong note. Not an explosion, not a gunshot, something more like a subsonic frequency being emitted from somewhere in the city, broad spectrum and pulsed, like someone sending a signal. His magic registered it at the same moment, a quality of interference in the ambient substrate that was artificial rather than natural, engineered to interact with something specific. He was at the balcony door in 3 steps. He opened it and stepped out into the cold December morning and stood still for exactly 4 seconds, listening, feeling, mapping the signal's origin against the city's geography. South, near the financial district. 4 sources, which meant 4 emitters, probably corner set around a defined area. He went back inside. "Mum," Lois looked up from her laptop. She read his face in 1 second flat. "How bad?" "I don't know yet. Can you call Dad?" "Already on the phone." She was already moving, already pulling her press credentials from the hook by the door with the specific efficiency of a woman who had been adjacent to the extraordinary for 25 years. "Hermione," she called toward the guest room. Hermione came out with her wand already in her hand, which Harry noted with approval. "I felt it too," she said. "The substrate interference, it's targeted." "I know." Harry looked at her. "You're coming." "Obviously." They went out the window rather than the door, faster, cleaner, no elevator, Harry carrying Hermione because she couldn't fly herself, which she bore with the expression of someone who had decided that dignity was less important than speed. They went up first, above the buildings. and Harry oriented himself against the signal and found the 4-point perimeter he'd predicted. The financial district on a Tuesday morning was dense with people, which was either a targeting choice or a complication depending on what Lex intended, and Harry didn't have enough information yet to know which. He came down on the roof of the Harrington building, 40 stories, good vantage over the perimeter, and set Hermione down, and they both looked at what was happening below. The 4 emitters were vehicle-mounted, black SUVs parked at the cardinal points of an intersection, each with a dish array on the roof that was pointing inward. The signal they were generating was invisible to the naked eye, but Harry could see its effect, a faint distortion in the air at the intersection center, like heat shimmer but colder, like the space itself was vibrating at a frequency it didn't like. The people on the sidewalks weren't affected yet. The signal was focused inward, narrow beam, waiting for something to walk into the center of it, or waiting to be activated fully. "It's a resonance trap," Hermione said quietly. "The signal is interfering with the magical substrate in a contained area. If you enter it, my magic gets disrupted." Harry studied the emitters. "But look at the secondary array on the south vehicle. That's not resonance tech. That's something else." Hermione squinted. She pulled out her wand and murmured something, and her vision sharpened, a clarity spell. Harry recognized the principle even if the specific incantation was slightly different from the ones he knew. "Radiation emitter," she said. "Narrow spectrum. Not kryptonite, the wavelength is wrong." She paused. "It's close to red sun frequency, but modulated. Designed to disrupt solar energy absorption rather than poison me directly," Harry said. "Smart. He doesn't want to kill me. He wants to study what happens when you pull the rug out from under both systems simultaneously. He's not here to kill you." Harry was certain about this. "Lex wants to understand what I am. Killing me is counterproductive to that goal. He could change that goal, if I gave him enough reason to." Harry looked at the street below. The intersection was busy, a bus stop on the north corner, a coffee cart, a woman with a stroller, the whole ordinary architecture of a Tuesday morning. The problem is the people. If he activates the full array, the substrate disruption will be wide enough to, at least 50 meters, Hermione said. The people closest to the center, they'll feel it, maybe more. Harry's jaw set. He's using the crowd as a containment mechanism. If I come in heavy, people get hurt. He knows I won't do that. "So what do you do?" Harry thought for approximately 3 seconds. Then he said, "I remove the constraint." He looked at Hermione. "South emitter, the radiation array, can you suppress the wavelength output?" "I can disrupt the emitter's power supply," she said, "but it'll take 30 seconds and I need line of sight." "You'll have it." He looked at her. "North and west vehicles I'll take simultaneously. East. What's at east?" Harry looked at the east SUV. There was a man standing next to it who was not a driver and was not an agent, slight build. A tablet in his hands, the specific body language of someone managing the technical systems rather than the operational response. Harry studied the man's face from 40 stories up. "He sent a technician to monitor the output in real time," Harry said. "That's the man who can shut it down, and he's frightened." He paused. "He doesn't want to be here." Hermione looked at the technician. "He was probably told it was a monitoring exercise," she said. "Not a trap. Probably." Harry looked at the intersection one more time, mapping it fully, every person, every angle, every variable he could identify. 50 civilians in the immediate zone. Tuesday commute traffic. 2 of Lex's operational agents visible in addition to the technician. Probably more he couldn't see. "Ready," he said. "Ready," Hermione said. He stepped off the building. He came down in the center of the intersection, without slowing, vertical drop from 40 stories, hitting the pavement at terminal velocity and just stopping. The impact absorbed completely by the combination of Kryptonian density and a reflex application of magical cushioning that he developed at 12 and had gotten very smooth. The pavement cracked in a neat circle around his feet, the shockwave radiating outward with enough force to rock the nearest parked cars, but controlled, directed down rather than out, minimizing civilian impact. The 4 emitters activated simultaneously. Harry had expected this. The signal hit him from all 4 directions, and he felt it immediately. The resonance interference like white noise in the part of him that was magic. A disruption of the clear channel he'd spent 16 years developing. Not painful, but disorienting. The way sudden static in an earpiece is disorienting. And underneath it, the red sun-adjacent radiation beginning its work on his solar reserves. Like a slow drain on something he was used to having full. He stood in it and cataloged what was happening. Honest inventory. The magic was disrupted but not stopped. The interference was clearly designed around an understanding of standard magical mechanics, someone's best model of how magic worked. And that model was good, but it wasn't right, because standard magical mechanics didn't account for 16 years of integration with Kryptonian biology. The interference was like static on a frequency you'd learned to hear clearly. Annoying. Workable. The solar drain was the more genuine threat. He could feel it operating on his cells, pulling the stored energy in a direction it wasn't supposed to go. Not devastating yet, but it had a cumulative quality that told him it would become significant inside 3 minutes. He had 3 minutes then, plenty of time. He looked at the North SUV. He raised his hand and the vehicle moved, not his physical grip. He was 20 feet away, but a focused application of telekinetic magic that hit the vehicle's chassis and lifted it cleanly off the ground, dish array and all, and set it down on its side against the far curb, away from the civilians, the emitter disc shearing on contact with the ground and going silent. The North signal died. The West vehicle's driver tried to pull away. Harry looked at it, and the engine block stopped. Not dramatically, not with fire, just seized. A precise interference with the mechanical system that was not a thing he'd been taught, but was something he'd worked out at 14 by paying close attention to how magical fields interacted with structured systems. The car stopped moving. He walked to it and put his hand through the dish array and felt the emitter's internals and pushed, and the dish array collapsed inward with a sound like a fist closing. West signal died. 2 down, 4 seconds elapsed. He turned toward the south vehicle and Hermione was already there. She'd come down from the roof by the fire escape. He could see her at the SUV's rear, wand out, speaking fast. The radiation array convulsed and went offline. Harry felt the red sun drain stop, the relief of it immediate. The East technician was running. Harry let him go for 3 steps. Then he said, "Wait!" He didn't shout it. He said it at normal conversational volume, and the magic in the word, not a spell, just intention wearing sound as a coat, carried it directly to the man's ears through the intersection noise, and the man stopped like he'd hit a wall. Harry walked toward him. The man turned slowly, his tablet held against his chest like it was armor, his face the specific color of someone who has been processing this morning at a pace that their cardiovascular system is objecting to. "I know you were told this was monitoring only," Harry said when he reached him. "You were told the array would generate data on a targeted individual in a controlled environment, non-harmful." He waited for the man's eyes to focus. "That's what you were told, yes." The man nodded. His eyes were going between Harry's face and the wreckage of 3 of the 4 SUVs and the wand-wielding woman walking toward them from the south. "You built the resonance array," Harry said. The man swallowed. "I developed the theoretical framework. The physical construction was..." "The theoretical framework," Harry said. He looked at the tablet in the man's hands. "The data you've been collecting this morning, is it transmitting live to Lex?" "Yes." "Then he already has it," Harry said, "which means your job here is finished." He looked at the man steadily. "Go home. You were in over your head this morning and you know it. What you built is impressive and was built for the wrong purpose, and that is not entirely your fault." A pause. "Go home!" The man looked at him. He looked at the tablet. He looked around at the intersection. The civilians who had scattered from the cracked pavement, and the overturned vehicles, but none of whom were hurt. The 4 emitters now offline. The entire operation dismantled in under 90 seconds. He went. Harry turned to find Hermione standing behind him with her arms crossed, and an expression that was partly impressed and partly the look of someone who had wanted to ask a question before the action started and had not had time. "The fourth emitter," she said. "You didn't take it down." "Number, why not?" Harry looked at the East SUV, still intact, its dish array still pointing inward but now with nothing to triangulate against because the other three were offline. "Because Lex is watching the feed," he said, "and I want him to see me leave it standing." "Why?" "Because taking it down would say I was trying to eliminate all evidence of what he tried," Harry said. "Leaving it says I don't care that he knows I know." He looked at Hermione. "I want to have an actual conversation with that man." "Not a war. And the way to have a conversation is to keep demonstrating that I'm not afraid of what he builds." Hermione looked at the emitter. Then she looked at Harry. "You know," she said, "that is either very wise or going to get us both killed." "Both of those things can be true," Harry said. Clark arrived 40 seconds after the last emitter went offline, coming in fast from the northeast, and landed at the intersection's edge with the expression of a man who had been flying at full speed and was now performing a rapid contextual assessment. He looked at the overturned SUV, the cracked pavement, the offline emitters, and his son standing in the middle of it looking entirely undamaged. "You handled it," Clark said. "Yeah," Clark's jaw worked. "I should have been. You were 40 seconds behind me," Harry said. "That's not a flaw in your response time, Dad. That's a function of geography. They targeted you specifically." "I know, it's fine." "Harry, it didn't work," Harry said. "None of it worked." He met his father's eyes. "I'm not saying that to dismiss the concern. I'm saying it because it's accurate. The resonance array was designed around an incomplete model of how my magic works. The radiation emitter was calibrated for adult Kryptonian physiology, not a developing one, which actually made it less effective rather than more. And the operational design assumed I'd either walk into the zone unknowingly or be prevented from acting quickly by the crowd presence." He paused. "I wasn't, and I wasn't, and I wasn't." Clark looked at him for a long moment. The post-crisis tension in him, the version of Clark that was entirely Superman, sharp and protective, and running on instinct honed by 15 years of using himself as a shield between the world and what would hurt it, was slowly reconciling with the part that was a father watching his son stand unhurt in the middle of an ambush site. "You let him run the experiment," Clark said. "The technician." "He was coerced. But more than that, you let the data transmit," Harry nodded. Clark looked at the intact fourth emitter, the implication of it. "You want Lex to know exactly what he's dealing with," he said slowly. "I want Lex to know exactly what he's not dealing with," Harry said. "Which is a threat." He looked at his father. "He built this because he's afraid. You can't reason with that fear if the person who's the subject of it is dismantling his research. You have to show them the research is insufficient." He paused. "All of it at once, clearly, so there's no ambiguity about what the gap is." Clark stood in the winter morning light of the financial district, with the sounds of Metropolis reconstituting itself around them. The wail of approaching emergency vehicles. The buzz of someone's drone camera that had caught the whole thing. The distant sound of the city that never stopped for any of it. And he looked at his son with an expression that had been showing up more frequently lately. The expression of a father keeping pace with a child who was outrunning him in specific and important ways. "When I was 16, Clark said, I was still figuring out the flying." "You're a late bloomer," Harry said. The corner of his mouth lifted. Clark made a sound that was mostly a laugh. He reached over and gripped Harry's shoulder briefly, the specific physical language of a man who had grown up in a family where love was expressed in gesture as much as in word. "You're going to call him," Clark said. It wasn't a question. "Today," Harry said. "Before he recalibrates." Clark nodded. He looked at the scene one more time. "I'm going to deal with the MCPD response," he said. "And then I'm going to deal with the part where my 16-year-old son had an armed encounter this morning, and I'm going to do that by taking several deep breaths and remembering that you are." "Fine," Harry said. "Remarkable," Clark finished. "And fine." He took off and the air moved where he'd been. Hermione was quiet on the way back to the apartment, which meant she was processing, which meant she'd have something specific to say when she was finished. Harry let her have the silence and thought about the call he was going to make. She came out with it over lunch. "He'll redesign," she said. "Better model, better calibration. The fact that the first attempt failed doesn't mean he stops." "I know. And the next attempt will account for the integration of your systems." He had a technician smart enough to build something that was genuinely close for a first effort. "Next time, the theoretical framework will be improved." "I know that, too. So what's the actual plan?" She looked at him across the table. "Not just demonstrate that you're not a threat, because that's a message and messages need to be received clearly, and a man who just watched his operation fail might not be in the optimal state to receive messages clearly." "The plan is to talk to him directly," Harry said. "Today, in person. He tried to trap you this morning." "He tried to study me," Harry said. "There's a difference, and I think he knows it, and I think if I call him on the difference directly, he'll acknowledge it." He leaned back in his chair. "He's a man who believes he's doing necessary work. You don't have a genuine conversation with someone like that by attacking the work. You have it by engaging the necessity." Hermione looked at him for a moment. "You know what you sound like." "Don't. You sound like Hermione, a certain headmaster who was very good at understanding people's fundamental drives and using that understanding to manage them toward a desired outcome." She watched his face carefully. Harry looked at her. It was not a comfortable comparison, and he felt its edges clearly. He sat with it. "The difference," he said finally, "is consent. I'm not shaping Lex toward a conclusion he doesn't know he's being shaped toward. I'm going to walk into his building and tell him exactly what I want and exactly why. He can say number, he can call his security. He can try another approach." He met Hermione's eyes. "I'm being direct, that's the whole thing, just direct." She nodded, not entirely satisfied but willing to accept the distinction. "I'm coming with you." "Obviously," Harry said. He called Lex's personal line, which Lois had acquired because Lois Lane had everyone's personal line. It was one of her primary superpowers, and it rang twice before Lex answered, which told Harry that he'd been expecting the call. "I watched the feed," Lex said, without preamble. "I know," Harry said. "I left you the fourth emitter for that reason." A pause, fractional. "I noticed. I'm coming to see you, this afternoon. Me and Hermione Granger, who is a dimensional traveler and a highly skilled magical practitioner and who was present at the intersection this morning, in case your feed caught her and you were wondering." He paused. "I'm not coming to threaten you or to make demands. I want a real conversation. After this morning, you want a conversation." "Especially after this morning," Harry said. "Your experiment gave me useful data, too. I'd rather exchange findings than run parallel operations against each other. That's inefficient for both of us." Silence. Then, 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock, Harry agreed. LexCorp Tower was exactly what its exterior suggested, the architectural expression of a very specific kind of ambition. All clean lines and controlled extravagance. Nothing wasted and nothing humble. The lobby was the size of a city block and 3 floors tall, and it communicated, efficiently and without saying a word, that this was a place built by someone who took themselves seriously and expected you to do the same. Harry walked in with Hermione at his shoulder and felt the building's security systems register him the moment he crossed the threshold. Not just the visible cameras and the scanner arches, but the more subtle things. The electromagnetic monitoring arrays built into the floor. The spectrum analyzers in the ceiling panels that Lex had almost certainly added after this morning. He let them scan. He had nothing to hide. Lex met them in a conference room on the 48th floor. Not his office, Harry noted. A deliberate choice of neutral ground, and he was alone, which was either genuine trust or a demonstration of it. And with Lex Luthor, the difference between genuine and demonstrated was often thin enough to be functionally irrelevant. He looked at Hermione with the specific focus of someone who had spent the morning building a file and was now cross-referencing it against the primary source. "Miss Granger," he said, "dimensional resonance traveler, British, magical practitioner. You were the one who took down my radiation emitter." "I was," Hermione said without apology. "The wand is a conduit rather than the source," Lex said. "The way a circuit board is not the electricity." "Correct. And you're from the same universe of origin as Harrison." "Yes." Lex looked at Harry. He was doing the thing he always did, the layered assessment, the real-time threat modeling, the running calculation of what the information in front of him meant. But there was something else in it today that hadn't been there before, something that had shifted in the hours since the morning's events. He looked slightly less certain than he had in the apartment 3 weeks ago, and in Lex Luthor, slight uncertainty was the equivalent of full-scale doubt in anyone else. "What did you learn this morning?" Harry asked. He sat down without waiting to be invited. Hermione sat next to him. Lex sat across from them. He considered the question seriously, which Harry respected. "That the resonance interference model I was working from is flawed," Lex said. "The assumption was that the magical system and the Kryptonian system operated in parallel with minimal interaction. The morning's data suggests that's wrong. They're integrated at a level that makes targeting either system independently less effective." "Much less effective," Harry said. "The resonance interference hit a degraded version of my magical channel because the Kryptonian biology acts as a buffer, and the radiation array was calibrated for full solar saturation, which I don't have yet. Another 6 or 7 years of yellow sun absorption and it might be a more serious problem. Right now, Lex looked at him. "You're telling me this." "I'm being direct with you," Harry said. "The same way I asked you to hold 2 things separately the first time we spoke. I'm not going to pretend the morning didn't happen, and I'm not going to pretend you're not going to keep developing counters. But I'd rather you build them from accurate data than from models that are going to keep failing, because the theoretical foundation is wrong." He paused. "And in exchange, I'd like you to explain to me exactly what you're afraid of. The real version, not the framework, the actual fear." Lex was quiet for a moment. The conference room was 50 floors above the city, and the winter light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows, flat and gray. Below them, Metropolis moved in its perpetual motion, entirely indifferent to what was happening in the room. "There is a man," Lex said, "who can move mountains. Who is invulnerable to almost everything we can produce. Who operates according to his own ethical framework, answers to no elected body, and whose continued benevolence is contingent on that framework remaining stable." He looked at Harry. "Every year he remains active. The infrastructure, the defense systems, the governments of this planet make decisions that assume his presence and his benevolence as a given. We become more dependent. Our own capacity to protect ourselves atrophies." His voice was measured and entirely without cruelty. "That is a civilizational scale vulnerability, and I am the only person in a position of influence who is consistently willing to say so." "You're not wrong about the dependency risk," Harry said. Lex stopped. "The dependency is real," Harry said. "I've thought about it. A world that outsources its safety entirely to beings it doesn't understand and can't hold accountable is a world that has made a genuine structural error." He met Lex's gaze. "But your solution, the counterweapons, the vulnerability research, the effort to build a technical equivalent to what you're afraid of, that's not solving the dependency. That's creating a parallel arms race with a different kind of civilizational risk. And what would you propose instead?" The question was sharp but not dismissive. "Accountability structures," Harry said. "Real ones. Not the performative oversight that currently exists, not the League's internal ethics council that amounts to superheroes policing themselves. Genuine, external, meaningful accountability with teeth." He looked at Lex. "My father would accept that. He has always accepted that. He's been waiting for someone to build it properly instead of using it as political cover for acquiring leverage." A pause. "And I will accept it with one condition." "Which is?" "That it applies to all significant concentrations of power," Harry said, "including LexCorp, including governmental military programs, including anyone whose decisions can kill people at scale." He held Lex's gaze. "Not just the ones who can fly." The conference room was quiet. Hermione, beside him, said nothing. She had the expression of someone watching a chess game played at a level above what they'd expected and following carefully. Lex looked at Harry for a long time. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, not in its specifics but in its motion, the quick, extraordinary intelligence doing its work, cross-referencing, stress-testing, looking for the angle that invalidated what had just been proposed. He didn't find one. Harry could see the moment he didn't find one. "You're 16 years old," Lex said, again. "It keeps being true," Harry agreed. "And you're proposing a restructuring of global power accountability frameworks. I'm proposing the principle. The framework needs people smarter than me to build it. You, probably. Mum, definitely. Maybe a dozen others." He paused. "But someone needs to say the principle out loud in a room where it might actually be heard. So I'm saying it." Lex sat back. He looked at his hands on the conference table. He looked out at the gray December sky. He looked, finally, at Harry, and the expression had shifted into something that was stripped of the performance layers, not warm, because Lex Luthor did not do warmth easily, but real, the face of a man who had been given something unexpected and was deciding what to do with it. "If I continue developing counters," Lex said. "I won't stop you," Harry said. "You should have things that work. Genuinely. Because you're right that the dependency is a problem and having functional checks is part of solving it." He paused. "Just build them from accurate data, and build them in a context where the goal is balance rather than elimination." Another silence. "The light," Lex said. "In the harbor footage, what does it look like from inside?" Harry blinked. The question was unexpected, which meant it was the honest one. "Warm," he said after a moment, "like something that knows what it's doing." Lex nodded slowly, like this had confirmed something. "One more question," he said. "Go ahead." "The dimensional membrane," Lex said. "Miss Granger's arrival was tracked by 14 separate monitoring systems in addition to mine, the seam in the sky over Centennial Park. There are 17 groups I know of, governmental, academic, fringe, who have footage and are asking questions." He looked steadily at Harry. "That door is going to be opened wider, isn't it? Whatever is thinning between the dimensions." Harry was still. "It's already happening," Lex said. "I've been tracking the resonance increase for 8 months. I have better instruments than most." He paused. "What is coming through?" Harry looked at Hermione. She gave a small, clear nod. "Not something hostile," Harry said. "Not an invasion, something more like a system reaching equilibrium, 2 universes that were separated finding their level." He met Lex's eyes. "But equilibrium at scale can be violent even when it's not hostile, and the people in this world have no framework for absorbing what's going to come through." "How much time?" "Months," Hermione said. "Fewer than 12, possibly fewer than 6. Lex looked between them. His expression had arrived somewhere new, past the threat assessment, past the philosophical crisis, into the territory of a man confronting a problem that was genuinely, interestingly, usefully large. For all his fear and all his conflict, Lex Luthor was a man who woke up every morning wanting to engage with something that mattered. "What do you need?" he asked. Harry almost smiled. "Resources," he said. "Technic. The Arcanum has the magical knowledge, but not the engineering. We need someone who can bridge that." He tilted his head. "And we need the monitoring data you've been collecting. 8 months of resonance increase measurements would be enormously useful." Lex was quiet for a moment. In exchange, you get a seat at the table," Harry said. "When we work out what the convergence event looks like and how to manage it, your instruments and your engineering capability make the difference between managing it and failing to manage it." He paused. "And you get to be in the room where the accountability framework conversation starts." Lex stood up. He crossed to the window and stood with his hands behind his back, looking down at Metropolis. Harry watched him and waited, the patience of someone who had learned that real decisions required the person making them to arrive there themselves. "The morning's operation," Lex said. "I'll make it right with the civilians." "The pavement," Harry said. "I cracked the intersection. I'll cover the repair costs." "Deal." Lex turned from the window. "Mr. Kent," he said. His tone had a different quality in it now, not warmth, but something like the precursor to respect, the foundation layer that more complex feelings get built on. I want to be clear that I reserve the right to disagree with you fundamentally and to continue developing independent capability. Wouldn't have it any other way, Harry said. They walked out of LexCorp Tower into the December evening, the city going blue and gold around them, the early winter dark dropping fast over the skyline. Hermione walked beside him with her coat pulled close and her notepad in her bag and the expression of someone who had had a genuinely full day. That could have gone much worse, she said. It could have gone much better, Harry said. But better is a long-term project. She was quiet for half a block. Then, you know what Lex is going to do with the accountability framework idea. Try to shape it in LexCorp's interests, Harry said. Obviously. Let him. Having someone like him engaged with the process is more valuable than having him outside it building something unilaterally. He looked at the skyline. The framework will survive his attempt to reshape it. Good structures do. He paused. And he'll come to believe in it genuinely eventually. He's not an irredeemable man, he's a frightened one. Hermione glanced at him sidelong. Ron would never believe this conversation happened. Tell him anyway, Harry said. He'll appreciate the story, even if he doesn't believe it. She laughed, and it was lighter than any laugh she'd managed since falling out of the sky, which meant she was getting her bearings in this new universe, was finding the texture of it under her feet. The convergence, she said, quieter now. Harry, I haven't told you everything about the models. He looked at her. The stabilization, she said carefully. What I think you're capable of doing with the membrane, I believe it's possible, I do believe that. She met his eyes. But my best model of the stabilization event suggests it's going to take everything you have, every system, simultaneously, sustained. She paused. It will work, but it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Harry listened to this. He held it the way he held hard things, straight, not bending away from it. Harder than dying, he said. Hermione opened her mouth, closed it. I've done the hardest thing, Harry said. Once. I know what that feels like. He looked up at the December sky, at the first stars coming through the city light, real and distant and entirely unconcerned with the small, warm problems of people below them. Everything after that is just work. Hermione looked at him. This boy who had been her best friend and had died and come back as something magnificent, and who spoke about the hardest thing he'd ever done with the specificity of old knowledge and no drama whatsoever. Who had walked into an ambush this morning and come out the other side with a working relationship with the man who'd built it. Okay, she said. Then we have work to do. We do, Harry agreed. They walked into the metropolis evening, two people from the wrong universe building toward the right one, and behind them the LexCorp Tower stood in the golden dark of the winter skyline, its lights burning on all 54 floors, and somewhere on the 48th, a man with brilliant, frightened eyes sat at a conference table with the resonance data and a blank page and started writing. Chapter 5. What we carry forward, the convergence came early. Not by much. 11 days ahead of Hermione's most aggressive model, but 11 days was the difference between a managed process and a crisis. And Harry had been awake at 3 in the morning feeling it build for the past week, lying in the dark of his room with the resonance hammering at the edges of his perception like weather before a storm. Not the gentle bell sound of its early stages. Something larger. A pressure that had been growing for months, finally reaching the place where it couldn't grow anymore without doing something. He was on the roof when it started. January 2nd, 4:17 in the morning, the city below him in its deep night quiet, the coldest night of the winter so far, the stars above the cloud layer bright and indifferent. He'd come up an hour ago when sleep stopped being realistic and had been sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed, hands loose on his knees, running the stabilization methodology he and Hermione had been developing for 3 weeks. The methodology was elegant in theory. The membrane between universes was stressed at specific fault lines, 7 of them, distributed globally, corresponding to places where the magical substrate was naturally dense in this world, places that had been sacred or strange in human mythology for as long as human mythology had existed. If Harry could anchor the membrane at those fault lines simultaneously, reinforce the structural integrity at each point before the convergence energy tore them open further, the exchange could be managed rather than catastrophic, controlled rather than flood. The problem was simultaneously. 7 locations, 7 anchoring operations, each requiring a sustained and precise application of magical energy calibrated to the specific local substrate density, each needing to be held while the others were established, because releasing one fault line to move to the next would allow the energy already moving through the opening to destabilize the adjacent ones. 7 at once, sustained, from a single point. Hermione had spent 2 weeks cross-checking the math. Lex had run the engineering models 6 ways. The Arcanum's senior practitioners had reviewed the methodology and come back with expressions that landed somewhere between awe and professional concern. The consensus was that it was theoretically possible for someone with Harry's specific capability profile, and that it would require him to operate at a level of sustained output that had no known precedent. Harry had listened to all of this, thanked everyone for their analysis, and started practicing. He'd been practicing every night for 3 weeks, extending his reach, mapping the fault lines, learning the specific texture of each one. The one under the Sahara that tasted like dry heat and ancient stone. The one in the Pacific that felt like deep water and enormous distance. The one beneath Glastonbury that was so close to the British wizarding world's magical substrate that touching it felt faintly like coming home, which he set aside because he didn't have time for that kind of feeling right now. He knew all 7. He could touch all 7 individually with ease. He'd gotten to the point where he could hold 3 simultaneously for about 4 minutes before the sustained effort became genuinely difficult. He needed 7. For however long it took, he was working on it. He felt the 11-day shift at 4:17 and was on his phone to Hermione by 4:18. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd felt it too or had been awake waiting. "I know," she said. "I felt it 20 minutes ago. I've been running the updated models." "How long?" Papers shuffling, the sound of her thinking fast. "The energy build is accelerating. At the current rate, a pause. 48 hours, maybe less. The Pacific fault line is the one moving fastest. Once it opens past a certain threshold, the others cascade." "So we move now," Harry said. "Harry, the methodology is ready. I'm as prepared as I'm going to be." He stood up from the roof, feeling the cold January air that he couldn't feel and the weight of the membrane that he absolutely could. 48 hours gives us time to get everyone in position. The Arcanum practitioners at the secondary fault lines. "They can't anchor the fault lines the way you can," Hermione said. "We've been over this. The secondary practitioners can slow the energy bleed at the local sites, but the actual structural anchoring has to be me," Harry said. "I know." A silence. "I hate the model," Hermione said quietly. "I've looked for an alternative for 3 weeks and I hate that there isn't one." "The model is fine," Harry said. "Trust the math." "I do trust the math. I'm questioning the variable the math depends on." "I'm not going to break," Harry said. "Not defensive, just factual. I've pushed the simultaneous reach practice every night. Last night I held 5 fault lines for 6 minutes before I had to let one go. I know my limits and I know the shape of the gap between my current limits and what the methodology needs. They're closable." 6 minutes, she said. "The full stabilization could take, however long it takes," Harry said. "Hermione, go wake Lex, I'll call Dad." She made a sound that was frustration and agreement compressed into one. "Fine, but if you..." "I'll be fine," he said. "Go!" The next 6 hours were organized chaos. Clark was in the air before Harry finished the call, contacting the League to establish a global support perimeter, not to interfere with the stabilization, which required specific and specialized capability, but to manage whatever happened at ground level near the fault lines as the energy bleed increased. There would be visible phenomena. People would need help. Lex activated his monitoring network in under an hour, pulling live data from all 7 fault lines. Through the resonance instruments, his team had spent 3 weeks calibrating to Harry's specifications. His command center in LexCorp Tower became the data hub for the entire operation. 8 of his best people at stations. The real-time fault line analysis feeding to screens that looked like weather maps of something that wasn't weather. The Arcanum sent 12 practitioners to the 6 secondary fault lines, 2 per site, with instructions to apply pressure reduction techniques, slow the local energy bleed, give Harry more time at each anchor point. Delphine Marsh coordinated them personally from a satellite phone with the calm efficiency of someone who had been managing impossible situations for 40 years and had stopped being surprised by them. Hermione was Harry's eyes on the data. She stayed in the apartment, at the kitchen table, with Lex's live feed on her laptop and her own instruments spread across the surface, and she was going to talk him through the sequence and tell him when each anchor held. Lois was at the planet filing the story. Because Lois Lane was a journalist, and this was the story of the century, and Clark had stopped trying to talk her out of things like this a long time ago. She called Harry at 6 a.m. from the newsroom and said, "I'm not going to say be careful because you know what you're doing." "Thanks, Mom. I'm going to say," she paused, and her voice did the thing it sometimes did where the professional exterior dropped and what was underneath was just her. "Come home after, that's all." "I'll come home after," he said. Harry went to the roof at 10 a.m. It was a clear January morning, cold and sharp, the winter sun doing its low-angle thing that made Metropolis look like it had been drawn in yellow light. He stood at the center of the roof and looked at the city and the sky and let himself be still for a moment before the work started. He thought about the void between lives, the moving without a body, the direction without space. He thought about arriving in this world with his magic intact, about Martha Kent watching flowers bloom out of season by his feet and deciding to make cookies. He thought about Clark in the barn with the silver-white flame turning in a 7-year-old's palm, saying, good. He thought about Lois and the yellow legal pad and the question about the wand mechanics and the way she'd reached across the table and pressed his hand and then picked up her pen. He thought about Hermione falling out of the sky and him catching her 20 feet above Centennial Park and carrying her to the apartment for tea. He thought about Lex Luthor sitting at a conference table with a blank page and starting to write something. He thought about none of it being wasted. All of it, the first life and the second, the death and the transition and the growing up and the practicing on rooftops and the conversations and the fights and the friendships, none of it wasted, all of it load-bearing, all of it part of the structure of who he was going to be in the next hour. He put his earpiece in. "Hermione," he said. "Here," she said immediately. "Lex's feed is live. All 7 fault lines stable for now. Pacific is the most active energy bleed at 32% above baseline and climbing. Sequence. Pacific first, then the Sahara, then Glastonbury, the Siberian site, the Andes, the Indonesian cluster, and the Great Lakes fault last. It's the least active, and anchoring it last gives you the most time to recover between the harder ones. Copy." He closed his eyes. "Arcanum teams. All 6 secondary sites, confirmed active. Delphine says the Pacific secondary team is already seeing visible substrate activity. There's a light phenomenon over the water. People on the Hawaiian coast are filming it. League, your father is over Hawaii," she said. "He'll deal with whatever the filming people need." Harry nodded to himself. He let out a long, slow breath. Then he reached. The Pacific fault line was the biggest and the angriest, and touching it was like putting your hand into something enormous that had been under pressure for a very long time and was done being patient. He found the fault line's geometry, the specific shape of the stressed membrane, the places where it was thinnest, the cracks that were widening, and he braced against it. Not with force. Force was the wrong approach. He'd worked this out early. Force told the membrane it was under attack, and the membrane responded by destabilizing faster. The right approach was structural. Become part of the membrane itself. Reinforce from within. Let your energy signature integrate rather than oppose. The alloy principle, not 2 things fighting, One thing. He felt the fault line begin to steady, slow. The widening cracks stopped widening. He poured the anchoring energy into the structural gaps the way you'd pack a fracture with something stronger than what had fractured, and the membrane knit around it, and he held it. "Pacific," he said. "Holding." "Confirmed," Hermione said. "Energy bleed dropping down to 19% above baseline. Harry, that's hold it." He was already reaching for the Sahara. This was the variable. This was the gap between his current limits and what the methodology needed. The question of whether he could extend his reach from the first anchor to the second while holding the first. For 3 weeks he'd been working up to this, and last night with 5 fault lines he'd managed it for 6 minutes. And the principle was the same, but the scale was different, and the Pacific line was the hardest one in the sequence, and he was starting with it. He found the Sahara fault line. Dry and deep and old, the oldest of the 7, it had been stressed for millennia, loaded with the weight of ancient magic that had nowhere to go in a world without wizarding infrastructure to manage it. He touched it carefully. It was like touching a sleeping animal, large and still and potentially violent and very sensitive to anything that felt like aggression. He moved through it gently, finding the structural weak points with patience rather than speed, letting it register him as safe before he started the reinforcement. "Sahara," he said. 2 minutes. "Take what you need," Hermione said. 4 minutes. The Sahara fault line was vast. He worked through it section by section. And the whole time he was holding the Pacific anchor at the back of his awareness, like holding a door closed with one shoulder, while you dealt with the thing in the room. And the effort of both simultaneously was real, was genuinely demanding in a way that 5 fault lines last night in practice hadn't been. Because last night the fault lines were calm, and today the Pacific one was active and angry and required continuous pressure. "Sahara holding," he said, and reached for Glastonbury. In LexCorp Tower, Lex watched the data feed with an expression his assistant had never seen before. Every screen was active, every instrument reporting, the visual representations of the fault line energy signatures cycling through their real-time updates. And on the central screen, the pattern was clear. 2 fault lines stabilizing, their frantic energy signatures smoothing into something measured and controlled, and emanating from a single source point in Metropolis that showed on the resonance map as a white gold signal, clean and extraordinary, unlike anything the instruments had categories for. "He's holding both," one of his people said, quietly, like speaking too loud might break something. Lex said nothing. He watched the Glastonbury fault line begin to change. Glastonbury was the one that felt like home, and he'd been right that he didn't have time for it, and he pushed the feeling aside cleanly and went to work. The British magical substrate was dense and familiar, not his current life familiar, the other kind, bone-deep and older, the substrate that had soaked into him at Hogwarts for 7 years, that had been the medium his magic learned itself in. It recognized him in the impersonal way that a landscape recognizes the kind of creature that belongs in it, and the work here was faster because of that. He was holding 3 now. The Pacific was the constant pressure. The Sahara was large but stable once anchored. Glastonbury knit quickly, the membrane responsive, and he locked it and moved. 3 holding, he said. "I see it," Hermione said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it that was not controlled, something that sounded like watching a thing you'd calculated in the abstract become real in front of you and discovering the gap between knowing and seeing. "The cascade risk on the Pacific is dropping. The fault lines are talking to each other. Your anchors are creating a resonance between them that's self-reinforcing." "The alloy principle," Harry said. "Yes, Harry," the pause. "The Siberian site, it's moving faster than the model predicted. You need to get there before." He was already there. Siberia was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The fault line there had a quality of emptiness, a vast crystalline silence, and it was moving fast. The cracks here were not the slow spread of pressure buildup, but something more like a fracture propagating through glass. He felt the edge of real urgency for the first time. He pushed into it harder than he'd pushed any of the others. Not recklessly, precision mattered more under pressure, not less, but with a directness that the previous 3 hadn't needed. He found the propagating fracture and he got ahead of it, laying the anchoring energy in front of the crack rather than behind it, blocking its path, and felt the membrane shudder and resist and then hold. The effort of that, held against the other 3, was the first moment in the operation where he felt the edge of his capacity. Not the ceiling. The edge, a genuine awareness of the limit's location. He filed it and kept moving. "Siberia holding," he said. That was Hermione's voice. That was close. "Harry, take 30 seconds before the Andes." "I don't have 30 seconds," he said. "The Andes, active and climbing, 22 seconds. He was already reaching. The Andes fault line was high altitude and dense. The magical substrate here thick with the weight of civilizations that had understood the land as sacred and been correct without knowing the mechanism. He found it and worked it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this drill 100 times in the past 3 weeks, who knew the shape of these fault lines the way you know the layout of a room you sleep in, and the anchoring went in cleanly and held. 5. 5 holding, he said, and this was the wall. The wall he'd been running at in practice for 3 weeks, and hitting at 5. The place where his simultaneous reach was fully extended, where all 5 anchor points required active maintenance, where the Pacific was still pulling at him constantly, and he had 2 more to go. He could feel his own reserves. They were significant. This was the 16 years of yellow sun absorption in Kryptonian cells, the baseline that made everything else possible, and it was not depleted, was not close to depleted, but it was being drawn on in a way that was real and continuous, and he was 2 fault lines from the end. He breathed, the actual physical act of breathing, which he didn't need but which helped, which organized the system, which bought the quarter-second of reset that mattered. He reached for Indonesia. In the apartment, Hermione had stopped taking notes. Her pen was in her hand, but she'd stopped writing, and she was watching the screens and listening to his voice in her ear, and she was, despite everything, afraid. Not for the math was holding. Afraid for the him of it, for the part of this that was a person she knew standing on a rooftop running at the edge of themselves. And she was afraid because she had failed to protect him once, and the memory of that failure was always closer to the surface than she wanted it to be. "Harry," she said. "Still here," he said. His voice was even. "Indonesia," she said. "Southeast cluster, there are actually 3 sub-fault lines in close proximity. You need to anchor all 3 or the interaction between them." "I see them," he said. She shut up and let him work. Indonesia was 3 problems at once, each one manageable individually and collectively, a genuine test of whether the precision he'd been developing was actually precise enough. The 3 sub-fault lines were interacting, their energy signatures braiding together in a way that meant anchoring one created pressure on the other 2. He had to find the sequence, which one first, which one the anchor would stabilize rather than displace, and find it fast because he was holding 5 fault lines while he found it, and the Pacific was still talking. He felt the geometry of the 3 sublines, the way they leaned on each other, and he thought about alloys and he thought about integration rather than opposition, and he anchored all 3 at once, simultaneously, a 3-point hold that was smaller in scale than the full sequence operation, but required the same principle applied at a finer resolution. They held. 6. He had 6 fault lines. He was at the edge of the edge. He could feel the shape of his own limits with complete clarity now, not vague discomfort, but an exact knowledge of where the wall was, how close he was to it, how much remained on this side of it. The Great Lakes fault line. The last one, the least active, the most forgiving in the sequence. He reached for it across the continent, and it came to him almost easily, practically familiar compared to the others, and he found the anchoring points and started the work and felt everything. All 7 fault lines simultaneously. The membrane between universes held its 7 structural points. The energy exchange that had been building toward catastrophe, now channeled through the anchored points in controlled amounts. The flood converted into irrigation. He held all of it, and it was large and real, and demanding in a way that was qualitatively different from anything he'd done before. Not just the scale, but the sustained quality of it. He wasn't spending energy in a burst. He was being a structure, being load-bearing. He thought about Clark in the barn, one hand against the ceiling, holding a building that wanted to fall. He thought about standing in the wreckage of the harbor warehouse with 30 tons stacked above him, holding the shape of the thing. "It is done," a voice said in his memory, and it was not triumphant and not a ghost, just an old fact passing through, and Harry let it pass. "7 holding," he said. His voice was steady. "Hermione, I see it." Her voice was strange, thick with something. "Harry, I see all 7. The cascade risk is it's gone." The energy exchange is channeling through the anchor points in. A sound, almost a laugh, almost a sob, something in between. "It's working, the model is holding." "How long?" he said, not a question, a request for data. "Until the exchange equalizes," she said. "Until the pressure differential between the universes drops below the threshold where the fault lines would reopen." She was pulling numbers fast. "My best estimate, 40 minutes. Maybe less if the anchors remain stable." 40 minutes. He stood on the roof of the apartment building in Metropolis in January, with 7 fault lines held in his hands and the sun on his face, and let himself do the accounting. He had the reserves. The Kryptonian biology was doing what it was built to do, converting solar energy continuously, replenishing what was being spent, maintaining the baseline. The magic was flowing clean through both systems, the alloy principle functioning exactly as he'd theorized, the integration acting as multiplier rather than division. He was at the edge of his limits. He was not past them. He thought, good. Clark found him at the 20-minute mark. Not physically, Clark was still over the Pacific, managing the secondary phenomena that the controlled energy exchange was producing, the visible light effects, and the low-level atmospheric disturbances that were filling up every news feed in the world. But his voice came through a secondary calm, quiet, not interrupting, just present. "Harry, Dad, I can see the Pacific fault line stabilizing from up here," Clark said. "It looks," a pause, "I don't have a word for what it looks like." "Like a scar healing," Harry said. He'd been watching it with his magical perception the whole time. "That's what it feels like. The League is asking me what you need from them." "Nothing right now," Harry said. "Tell them thank you, genuinely." A pause. "How are you doing?" "I'm good," Harry said, and the extraordinary thing was that it was true. He was at his limit and he was holding and he was telling the truth. "I'm actually good, Dad." He could hear something in Clark's silence, something that was processing, something that was a father on the other side of the world listening to his son hold the membrane between universes together by sheer will and capability and saying, "I'm actually good," and finding that he believed him. "I'll be here," Clark said. "I know," Harry said. 23 minutes in, Hermione said, "The Indonesian cluster is the most stable. The Sahara is holding beautifully. The Pacific," she paused. "The Pacific energy exchange is dropping. The differential is decreasing." "I can feel it," Harry said. The Pacific fault line, which had been pulling at him like a strong current for the better part of an hour, was quieting, the angry restlessness of it settling into something steadier as the pressure equalized. "It's going to be okay," he said, not to Hermione specifically, just to the air, just to the January morning, just to himself. 31 minutes, Hermione said. "I think we're inside 15 minutes of equilibrium." Harry stood and held and let the work be the work. He thought about nothing in particular. He let his mind be quiet. He'd learned this in practice. Thinking too hard about the output disrupted the output, the same way thinking too hard about breathing disrupts breathing. He trusted the system. He trusted the alloy. He trusted 16 years of yellow sunlight and a magical core that had survived death itself and the specific fact of himself, Harrison James Kent, who was 2 people and 1 person simultaneously and had built something worth being from both of them. The Pacific fault line went still. Not fully closed, that wasn't the goal. The goal was equilibrium. The goal was the exchange becoming a stable channel rather than a rupture, but still in the way of something that had been thrashing and was now at rest. He felt it happen, the specific quality of the membrane settling around the anchor, and the relief of it was physical, like setting down something heavy. Then Sahara. Then Glastonbury. One by one, not because he released them, but because they reached equilibrium and held themselves, the fault lines settling into their new geometry, the membrane restructured around the 7 anchor points into something more stable than it had ever been, reinforced from both sides, the magical substrate flowing between the two universes at a rate that was sustainable, controlled, managed. "Harry," Hermione's voice. "The Great Lakes fault line has reached equilibrium. That's 7. A pause. "Harry, that's 7. He opened his eyes. The January sky over Metropolis was clear and blue, and the city was below him in all its perpetual motion. He was standing on a rooftop, and he was, as he had told his father, genuinely good. Tired in a way that had texture and weight to it, a deep physical tiredness that he was going to feel tomorrow and possibly the day after. But good. He sat down on the roof. Not dramatically, he just sat down, cross-legged, because sitting down seemed appropriate. He put his hands on his knees and breathed. "Hermione," he said. "Here." Her voice was steady now, the earlier thickness gone, replaced by the clear, controlled brightness of someone who had been frightened and is processing relief. "All 7 stable. Energy exchange is channeling cleanly. Lex's instruments are." A sound that was definitely a laugh. Lex says, and I am quoting directly, "The resonance signature is unlike anything in recorded data and the structural efficiency is frankly annoying." Harry laughed. It came out surprised and tired and real. "Tell him I said he's welcome." "He can hear you," Hermione said. "He's on the same comm." "Mr. Kent," Lex's voice said, dry as concrete. "The word I would use is impressive. The word annoying was Hermione's editorial." "It was not," Hermione said. "It really was." Harry laughed again, longer this time, and it moved through him and cleared some of the tiredness, and he tipped his head back and looked at the winter sky and felt the fault lines at the edges of his perception. Quiet now, settled, the membrane between worlds restructured into something sustainable, something that would hold. Clark landed on the roof 20 minutes later. He came down in his suit, which he didn't often wear around the apartment building, and he stood at the roof's edge for a moment looking at his son sitting cross-legged in the January cold before he crossed to him and sat down. They sat side by side on the rooftop. Below them, Metropolis moved through its afternoon. On the news, which Harry could distantly hear through a dozen apartment windows if he chose to listen, the world was trying to describe what had happened. The visible light phenomena over 6 continents, the brief atmospheric disturbances, the instruments at universities and observatories and government monitoring stations that had registered something vast and unprecedented, and were producing analysis that ranged from the accurate to the spectacular. "The League is calling it an atmospheric event," Clark said. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet." Clark looked at the skyline. "I'm still working out how much to say." "The truth, eventually," Harry said. "The world is going to need a framework for what just happened, for what the fault lines are now. Because it's a stable configuration, but it's not invisible. The energy exchange is going to produce phenomena that people will see and measure, and they deserve an explanation that's real." Clark was quiet for a moment. "You want to tell them about magic." "I want to tell them about the world they actually live in," Harry said. "Which includes magic, yes. And the fact that there are 2 universes in contact." He paused. "This is going to sound familiar, but hiding it doesn't help anyone. It just means people are confused and frightened instead of confused and curious." Clark absorbed this, turned it over. Harry watched his father's face move through the familiar stages, the instinct toward protection that was so deeply ingrained it predated thought, the careful consideration that followed, and then the slow arrival at a place that was past both, a place that was just clear. "Your mother already has a draft," Clark said. Harry smiled. "Of course she does. She's been writing it since this morning." A pause. "She called it The Day the World Changed and What We Owe the Truth. That's a great headline." "She has her moments." Clark looked at him sidelong. "You should read it before she publishes it. She doesn't need my approval." "She'll want your input," Clark said, "as the person who held up the sky this morning." Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at the city. "I didn't hold up the sky," he said. "I held the membrane, that's different." He paused. "The sky held itself, it always does." Clark looked at him with that expression, the one that had been showing up more frequently, the one that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite awe but had elements of both and something more fundamental underneath, something that was just love wearing its plainest face. "Harry," he said. "Yeah, I need to tell you something." Clark's voice had shifted, not serious in the crisis way, but in the real conversation way. "When I was your age, when I was figuring out what I was and what that meant, I spent a lot of years being afraid of the wrong things." Harry waited. "I was afraid of being seen," Clark said. "Of being known, because I'd grown up understanding that being known was dangerous, that the world wasn't ready, that people would be afraid of what I could do and I needed to be smaller than I was." He paused. "And that produced good things. Humility, caution, care about impact." He looked at Harry. "But it also produced a version of me that spent years apologizing for existing, in the quiet internal way that doesn't make a sound but costs something." Harry said nothing. He was listening the way he listened to important things completely, not preparing a response, just receiving. "You've never done that," Clark said. "Since you were 7 years old on a hay bale in the barn, you have never apologized for what you are." He paused. "I thought for a long time it was something I should worry about. The comfort with yourself. I kept waiting for it to become arrogance or carelessness. It never did." He looked at his hands. "I think you figured something out that I had to spend 30 years working toward." "What's that?" Harry asked. "That being extraordinary is not something you owe people an apology for," Clark said. "It's something you owe them the honest use of." He looked at his son. "You've been doing that since day one." Harry was quiet for a moment. The city was below them, the afternoon light going gold and long over the buildings, the winter sun doing its early exit toward the horizon. "I had a head start," he said, "knowing what happens when someone extraordinary tries to make themselves small for other people's comfort." He paused. "It doesn't protect you. It just makes you easier to use." "Dumbledore," Clark said. "Dumbledore," Harry confirmed. "He needed me to believe I was limited, that my value was in the specific role he designed for me, that stepping outside that role was selfish or dangerous." He looked at his hands, the hands that had been holding 7 fault lines an hour ago, that had been holding 30 tons of warehouse ceiling at 16, that had made silver-white flame in a dark barn when he was 7 years old. "The moment I understood that believing in your own limits as a form of humility is sometimes just the story powerful people tell you to keep you manageable," he shook his head. "I stopped believing it." Clark nodded, slowly, like a man confirming a theorem he'd been working on for a while. "I should have gotten here faster," Clark said. "You got here," Harry said. "I mean the lesson. You're here now," Harry said. "That's what matters." Clark put his arm around Harry's shoulders, the same gesture as the barn when Harry was 7, and Harry leaned against it, and they sat on the roof in the January afternoon while the world below them moved forward into whatever it was going to be next, which was different from what it had been this morning in ways that were going to take a long time to fully understand. Hermione came to the roof at 5. She had her coat and her notepad and 2 cups of tea from the kitchen, and she handed one to Harry and sat on the other side of him, so he was between her and Clark, which felt geometrically appropriate for reasons he didn't try to analyze. "Lex sent over his final resonance report," she said. "The membrane is—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Healthy. That's the word his team used, which is interesting because it's not a technical term and it's exactly correct. The energy exchange is balanced. The fault lines are anchored. It's going to need monitoring and possibly maintenance over the coming years, but the catastrophic convergence scenario is closed." "Closed," Harry said. "Closed." He held his tea and felt the settled quiet of the fault lines at the edges of his perception. Not silent, they were never going to be silent, they were living systems, the substrate of magic flowing between 2 universes with all the activity that implied, but settled. The difference between a storm and a river. "I need to go back," Hermione said. Harry nodded. He'd known this was coming. "Ron needs to know." The ministry needs to know, some version of it, carefully managed, because the magical world on my side is going to start noticing the change in the substrate and they're going to need a framework. She paused. And honestly, she stopped. A moment, Harry said. Yes, she looked at him. A moment, to process what I've been carrying and what I've watched today and what it means that you're, she gestured, a small, comprehensive gesture that covered all of it. This. What am I? Harry said. She thought about it seriously, which was the Hermione way. You're someone who made something good out of something terrible, she said. Without making the terrible thing smaller than it was, without needing it to have been necessary in order to justify surviving it. She paused. That's hard to do. I'm not sure I've done it yet. You've had 4 years, Harry said. You're doing it. I suspected and didn't act, she said. And you've been living with that, he said. Which is itself a kind of accountability. You haven't let yourself off the hook. That matters. He looked at her. At some point you're going to have to let yourself off the hook. Not yet, she said. No, he agreed. Not yet, but at some point. She nodded once, the quick, precise nod of someone filing an instruction for later. I'm going to open the bridge tonight, Harry said. Before the fault line activity drops further, the Glastonbury anchor is the natural transit point. The substrate there is compatible with interdimensional travel, and it's the most stable of the 7. I can hold a bridge open for about 10 minutes. That's enough, she said. They drank their tea. After a while, Clark, who had been quiet for the last part of the conversation, said, You should come back when you've sorted things on your side. Hermione looked at him. Clark was looking at the skyline with the expression of a man saying something he meant simply. This world could use someone like you, Clark said, if you wanted it. Hermione looked at Harry. Don't look at me, Harry said. That's his offer to make. She paused. I'd need to know that there was actual work here, that I wasn't just. The dimensional membrane is going to need management, Harry said. The magical world in this universe is going to need someone who knows what a functioning wizarding society looks like to help them develop frameworks. The Arcanum is good, but they've been operating in isolation for a century. He paused. And frankly, Lex Luthor building things designed to counter magic is considerably safer if there's someone on the project who actually understands magic. Hermione considered this. The notepad was in her hands, apparently reflexively. Yes, she said. All right, yes. He opened the bridge at midnight. The Glastonbury fault line, felt from a rooftop in Metropolis, was a warmth at the back of his perception, the most familiar of the 7, the one that tasted like old stone and candle smoke and the specific magic of a world that had been doing this a long time. He reached into it and found the interdimensional transit point, the place where the membrane was thin enough and the substrate compatible enough, and he held it open. It looked nothing like the rift that had brought Hermione through. No violence. No seam tearing. Just a door, oval-shaped, silvery at the edges, standing in the January night air above the apartment building with the quiet confidence of something that had been asked to exist politely and had agreed. Hermione stood at the edge of it. She could see through it. A different sky, darker, stars arranged slightly differently, the specific dark of British midwinter, and somewhere in it, the faint warmth of magical substrate that was home in the deep encoded way that smell is home. She turned to Harry. Tell Ron I said the Chudley cannons are always going to be terrible, Harry said. She laughed, real and warm. He'll have a lot of feelings about that. Also tell him, Harry paused. Tell him I'm okay, that it all turned out okay. Hermione looked at him. In the silver light of the open bridge, she looked like herself more fully than she had at any point since she arrived, like proximity to her own world was already restoring something. I'll tell him, she said. She stepped through the door. It closed behind her without drama, the membrane settling back into place, the Glastonbury anchor holding the seal, the world quiet on both sides. Harry stood in the January night air above Metropolis and watched the door disappear, and felt the 7 fault lines at the edges of his perception, quiet and steady, and the city below him humming its perpetual hum. Clark was somewhere over the Pacific, doing something league-related. Lois was at the planet finishing her draft. Martha Kent was probably asleep in the farmhouse in Smallville, her garden going dormant under January frost, waiting for the unreasonable flowers that would bloom there when her grandson came to visit in spring. Harry stood in the night and let the world be exactly what it was. He was 17 in 3 weeks. He had 2 lives worth of context and 1 life to live it in, and the life he was living was, by every possible measure, a good one. Not uncomplicated. Not without the work of being what he was in a world still learning what he was, but good in the way that things are good when they are genuinely, fully, specifically themselves. He thought about Dumbledore one last time, not with grief or anger or the philosopher's consideration of a man's complexity. Just a thought, the way you think of old weather. It happened. It shaped him. The shaping was real and the shaping had costs, and here he was on the other side of it himself. "It is done," some old voice said in his memory, and Harry looked at it and let it go and turned his face toward the city. He jumped off the roof. Not a fall, a launch, a choice, up and out and fast into the January night. The cold air that he couldn't feel rushing past him as he climbed. The city falling away below, and the stars coming clearer above the cloud layer, and the world expanding in every direction the way it always did at altitude. The way it had since he was 11, and Clark had taken him above the clouds for the first time and told him, "Nobody owns this part. This part is just yours." He leveled out above the cloud layer, above the city, in the clear dark between the weather and the stars. He was Harrison James Kent. He was a wizard and a Kryptonian and a journalist's son from Smallville and a metropolis boy, and the person who had just held the membrane between worlds together with his hands and his magic and 16 years of yellow sunlight. He was the boy who had died once and decided that was enough dying. He was his father's son and his mother's son and his grandmother's and his own. He looked at the stars. Then he went home for dinner.